What is equalization? So again, we have Christy Wright, the PVR Field Director, and myself, Deanna Robitaille, District Advisor, and we'll have some question and chat moderating by Beth Miller.
Many people believe that equalization and sales ratio are synonymous. And we're going to try to explain to you kind of the differences. Every state performs their equalization study differently, and Vermont is not an exception. In Vermont, we perform a sales ratio study each year as part of the equalization study to determine how close properties in each town are being assessed compared to their current fair market value. This process is similar to other states, although there are some differences in the mechanics from state to state.
So for example, in the simplest terms, if property X sells for $200,000, you would expect the town assessment to be close to that value. However, because of changes in the market and the fact that their last town reappraisal was 8 years ago, the assessment might be $150,000. This one property is assessed at 75% of fair market value, or 150,000 divided by that $200,000 sale price.
In order to determine what level of appraisal a town is at relative to 100%, we compare all valid or arm's length transactions or sales to the assessment value in the town. Town assessments, we call it listed value at time of sale, are compared to the sale price for all valid sales within a 3-year period. Vermont utilizes 3 years of sales data to ensure we have enough sales for smaller towns and can achieve a valid sampling. And I'm just going to hit on that a little bit while we're on it, Deanna. For some towns that are larger, they might say, well, that doesn't make sense because I have enough sales. What we have to do in Vermont is we have to have a one size fits all. So in order to accommodate the small and the large, we use 3 years of sales to try to get what's considered a statistically valid sample.
Awesome explanation. Thanks, Christy. All right. So what is a valid arm's length sale? As part of this process, the towns have the opportunity and responsibility to review all the sales and provide information to us about whether each sale should be included in the study as a valid arm's length transaction. Oops. Sorry, technical difficulty.
That's okay. I was going to hit on that one a little bit too, even though we're going to go into it more. I like to think about it, and I think the reason that it got this name is if you think about arm's length, you could picture the buyer standing at a table across from the seller, and they are reaching out at arm's length to shake hands and make a deal. It's a fair deal, in other words, not influenced by anything else that would create it to be an unfair deal. So we're making an agreement without any other influence, arm's length across the table. Okay, and this will probably give you a little more. An arm's length transaction is any deal, contract, or agreement between parties who have no significant relationship with each other, be it familial, friendly, or business related. In this sort of transaction, no party has influence or control over the other. They are independent entities, each acting in their own self-interest.
Hey, Christy.
Yes.
This is Teresa. Can you touch just quickly on, I know that sometimes when listers or assessors are looking at transactions and they consider whether it's marketed or has been on the market, sometimes that's not always, it doesn't have to be an MLS listing to be a valid sale. Can you touch a little on that?
Sure, and I think we'll touch on it later, but I will here as well. So it's in this market particularly, it's super hard to say that something is not marketed, right? Because with all of the types of media we have, there's probably logically in most cases, some type of marketing, right? Be it, I put it on Facebook, I put it on Craigslist, I put it in a circulation like picket fences, right? There's so many pieces that it's really, really hard to say it wasn't marketed. Even if I were to put just a sign at the end of the road, right? It's marketed to the public. I put it on notice to the public. Yes, granted, they had to drive by in order to see it, but I put it on notice. So it becomes a little harder the more media we have and the more ways that we have to market, quote, quote, something, to say that it wasn't in fact marketed. And then the other piece, which I think Deanna will probably touch on, is it really depends on what your area is used to, right? Is your area not used to something being publicly marketed on MLS because that's not the way anyone in that area ever finds out about sales? In the Northeast Kingdom, where Deanna's from, that would be the case. It's less likely that things would be marketed in the same way. So you have to know your market, know what the marketing is, and really, really dig if you think it wasn't marketed. And that's where we come in to say, okay, but was it? Right? Can you really show that it wasn't in fact marketed, that it wasn't open to equal buyers on the market? And then the last piece of that for me, which we're going to talk about in the definition, is even if it wasn't in a circulation somewhere, was it a fair deal? Was it the same price that anyone else would pay if they reached across the table? Okay, so is it fair market value in the price? Willing buyer, willing seller. I could probably go on all day. Was that what you were looking for?
Yes, thank you.
And as far as the Northeast Kingdom with all the lakes and stuff they have going up or on over there, that market traditionally didn't have a lot of MLS exposure, particularly for the lakefront sales. They do the for sale by owner signs on the lakefront as well as at the end of the driveway because they really wanted people that were driving around and enjoyed that location to realize that there was something now available for purchase that might not have been when they were renting a camp down on the other end of the lake or something. So it, again, as Christy said, it really depends on your market and what's typical in your market. So yeah, we can go from there. So what is an arm's length sale or fair market value? In order to understand whether or not a sale is a valid sale, you also need to understand what fair market value is. Fair market value is defined in Title 32, subsection 3481, as the estimated fair market value of a property is the price that the property will bring in the market when offered for sale and purchased by another, taking into consideration all the elements of the availability of the property, its use, both potential and prospective, any functional deficiencies, and other elements such as age and condition that combine to give property a market value. In determining estimated fair market value, the sale price of the property in question is one element to consider, but it is not solely determinative. Christy, you usually expand on that one a little bit.
And I have a comment in the chat to follow this. Okay.
Sure, go ahead, Beth.
Okay, so Pamela writes, we have had properties sell as a right of first refusal. And then she states this would not be an arm's length sale, correct?
Typically not, but I always say typically because there could be a case where they may have agreed right of first refusal as determined fair market value at the time of sale. Right? So you have the ability to purchase it, but you must purchase it at what is determined to be fair market value at that time. That could be a caveat, right? That we might consider it if that were in the reading. But for the most part, no. Any difference of opinion there, Deanna?
No, I would agree with you because as we talk through all of these things, particularly in the next segment with all of the different special circumstance codes that are available to us, you're going to find that the recurring theme is going to be except or in this case. There are exceptions to almost every rule. And I like to say that assessing is more of an art than a science,
Yep.
taking wide brush strokes. And again, it's specific to the market. So if you truly feel like something is invalid, then provide us a good argument, documentation to support it, and hope that we're going to agree with you. If we don't agree with you, we're certainly going to have an explanation why. But that's the type of research and investment that we're expecting listers to make in the study so that we can have a good result on the other end.
And you know, just in terms of this definition, this is a statutory definition that we go through in the statutes. And if you look at it, what always stands out to me is all these pieces that we talk about, right? For sale and purchase by another, all of the elements, all of the potential, which would lead you to highest and best use, the functional deficiencies, which you would think about depreciation, age and condition. Again, all of those things are what we talk about when we look at a lister's card, right? So it's what is driving that sales price? What am I marketing it based on, and what will affect the price? These are all the pieces that someone might consider when they're buying a property. And then that very last piece is just kind of to let you know that the sales price, you know, when you go to appeal, this is always a good one to have in your back pocket, that yes, the sales price is a good indication or one element to consider in the fair market value, but because of all these other things, it might not be the only determinative. So, you know, if something was sold at auction, if something was a foreclosure, yes, I have a sales price, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's a fair market value sale price. So it's one element and not solely determinative.
All right, we'll break for questions again in a couple minutes.
Okay, so what would make a sale not arm's length or not fair market value? There are many reasons a sale may not be considered valid for PVR purposes, for our study purposes. And here's some examples that we can kind of dig into and talk about, and we'll talk about in the next section as well. A sale from a family member, such as a parent to child, typically not fair market value, okay? A sale from an estate with no market exposure, and I would add and or the sale price was affected by the fact that it was an estate. A sale from a bank after foreclosure or to the bank in lieu of foreclosure. A sale from a corporation to a member of that same corporation. And a sale from a government agency or to a government agency. And if you think about these, that arm's length transaction piece that I talked about feels like there would be a little piece taken away from that by each of these items, or there could be, right? And a couple of these, particularly estates, come into that category that Deanna talked about of, well, okay, maybe, and we have to consider other, you know, we always have to look at it a little deeper. Just because we see the word estate doesn't necessarily mean it can't be fair market value. But these are kind of some big triggers that we start with to question and say, probably not. Okay.
All right. And again, we're going to cover all of these things in much more detail in portion 2 of our presentation.
Yep.
Quick question here. What about the sales? We saw a number of these a couple of years ago when the market was really hot, where the buyers purchased the property sight unseen.
So I would say that sight unseen might not be the case, even if they were not in the area to set foot in the property. Realtors were extremely diligent about posting video walkthroughs. They were available pre-pandemic, but they would also, with their client, go to the property and with their video phone, walk them around the property to look at things. So sight, I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Christy, but sight unseen is not always simply that they weren't in the state when they purchased the property.
Right. And for me, I would also go back to, even if perhaps sight unseen, they probably saw some pictures online at least, et cetera, and any other buyer out there had the opportunity to purchase that property at the same price, be it sight unseen or not. And this is what someone was willing to pay, right?
And
So
in all reality, sorry to cut you off there, Christy. In all
that's okay.
reality, we didn't know it when it started, but that was the market that what we were coming into. So we
Correct.
also have to take into account what is expected in that particular market. We may not know it in the moment, particularly if we're in a smaller town that doesn't have a lot of sales, but we need to look for those trends and make those judgment calls based on what we're seeing overall, not just on those individual sales.
Yep.
Another quick question on estate sale. If a estate sale was assessed by an appraiser, would this be a valid sale if it was not put on the market? Would, was that appraisal, if it was met, I'm assuming this is the question, if the price was met that the appraiser had set, is that a valid sale? And Shelley, if that's not if that's not the correct interpretation of the question, my apologies, and say something in chat.
I'm going to give that one a big maybe, probably. I'd have to dig into that a little bit more because there's, was it appraised with limiting conditions that were in the appraisal? There's a lot of pieces there that I don't know. So I can't say absolutely. And unfortunately, that's often the answer.
Yeah, and I think that every town is going to run into those, handful of sales that just don't look quite right, but they can't really put their finger on it. Those are the ones that we really hope that you're going to be reaching out and discussing with your district advisor, or putting, a descriptive comment in the sales validation program that you'll see later on this morning, explaining why you have a question and what you might like us to look for. But really, there's great value in touching base with your DA, particularly on these specific types of sales.
Yeah, and I will just add what I mean by limiting conditions. When somebody does a fee appraisal, there might be a lot of conditions that are in all the narrative of the appraisal that affected what the value was and their assessment of what the value was. So, for example, if they were assigned that project, it could say this appraisal is as of 1999 for some reason, right? So without knowing those details, I don't know whether it's current fair market value and whether that appraisal was representing current fair market value. If in fact it was, then there's a possibility it could be a good sale.
And that appraisal could also be taking into account items or certain characteristics of the property that the listers aren't
Right.
aware of because they
Yep.
haven't reappraised in 5, 6, 10 years, whatever the case might be. So, but again, we're going to cover most of these very specific types of questions in the second segment. So, not to say that we should hold off on all questions, but if they're specific to why we're excluding a sale, let's wait until the middle segment. All right. So a few more reasons why a sale may not be considered valid for PVR purposes. Sale where only a portion of the property was sold, a sale where only a portion of the rights to the property were sold, a tax sale, sale from a non-taxable entity, and owner financing. And before we move on, I just want to edit my comment from a moment ago. Feel free to keep adding your questions to chat so we don't lose track of them. And that way we're not all frantically typing at one time and not hearing the answers to the questions when we get there.
Okay. Other reasons a sale might not be included, and that means might not be included in our study. Because we at PVR are comparing the town assessment to the sale, we always want the property that sold to be the same as what was listed by the town. Apples to apples, so to speak. Because of this, we may also exclude some sales if they are not apples to apples that might be valid for other purposes. For example, subdivision sales. In a subdivision, only part of the property that was listed by the town has sold. So for example, 10 acres was sold from an assessment of 50 acres that the town had. For our purposes, those two things are not the same. You would not want us to compare the listed value on 50 acres to the sale price on 10 acres because it's not apples to apples. Okay. Next one is major improvements to the property. Example would be the property sold with a garage in place, which was not yet listed by the town. Okay, because we use listed value at time of sale. The town might not have picked up that garage, so the sale included a garage, but the listed value didn't. Again, not apples to apples. And then the last one is an abutter sale, or in other words, a sale to a contiguous property owner. Okay. And for us, in our study, we have to have a one size fits all for the entire state. So these are our parameters that we will exclude a sale from the study. And the point being here is that these sales might still be good for your purposes when you do a reappraisal or when you study your market. You certainly would want to look at land sales of 10 acres, right, as an indication of what's going on in the market. But for this purpose, we don't have an exact match. So the point being, they might be good for you in some scenarios where they're not good for us in others. Okay. Anything to add on that, Deanna?
Just that when we say apples to apples or might be good for you, but not for us, what we're really talking about is at the time of reappraisal, your reappraisal contractor is going to be using sales that are indicative of your market to build your land schedule and your cost tables. So what they might feel, or you might feel at that time, is a valid sale, may be a subdivision, right? Because if you have a nice unimproved 10-acre lot that was sold and we said it was invalid for this particular year, but 2 years down the road, you're going to have a new land schedule rolled out with your reappraisal, it would be valid for that purpose. And that's why when we do the reappraisal, we also give you back 3 years worth of sales to re-verify them. So in the non-reappraisal years, we have to use a different methodology. And then PVR is also tasked with being fair and equitable. So if we're going to remove abutter sales for one town, we have to remove them for all. That way everybody's being treated the same. Again, two different purposes, both are totally acceptable. All right, so what is equalization? Our goal is to use the best and most accurate representation of sales in the town to calculate an overall sales ratio. So if you can imagine all the valid sales in a town being used by comparing the assessed value or listed value to sale price for each, that is the bulk of a sales ratio study.
Deanna, can you back up to the last slide?
This one?
Yes, I believe so.
Okay.
So, Deb has a question. Can you unmute Deb Madden? I don't have the question in the chat. I was just asked to back up to the last slide.
Jen, are you able to unmute her?
Yeah, I just need to find her just a second here.
Yep.
Oh,
Thank you,
she's
Jen.
typing. Yep.
Oh, she says she doesn't have a mic, so she's typing.
Okay.
I don't know. Oh. What if we don't know that the property has had major improvements? is the
Um,
question.
actually, that's a great question. This becomes harder for towns that don't have zoning. If you have zoning, in theory, and most times you would know if it's a major improvement, right? Because we would be talking about something that would be an add-on that they would likely have to get a permit for. When we talk about interior renovations, it's going to be a little bit harder to find out. And we're really talking about major improvements here, right? So you'd really have to be able to prove two things. One, that they in fact had major improvements that really, really affected that sales price. And the second thing is that you addressed those differences in the subsequent grand list, because what you have to understand is we're also trying to measure the quality, right, and the upkeep of your grand list. And over time, your grand list is going to miss things, which is the point of having a reappraisal, right? You can't possibly catch everything that's happening every year. So over time, your data becomes stale and you may not know. And that's one of the things that we're trying to measure is how stale is the data and do you need a reappraisal?
All right.
Thank you.
And I think that we were here.
Okay. So again, what is equalization? Equalization is a sales ratio study is one part of what equalization is. A sales ratio study compares listed values to sale price for an overall percentage or ratio that represents the level a town is assessing at relative to 100%. Statistical measures are used to make sure the results are reasonable and consistent.
All right, so on the screen, we have a sample of last year's certified final report for the city of Montpelier. And we have some arrows. I thought we had some arrows that were going to fly in. There we go. Talking about the pieces of information that you should be focused on in reviewing your sales, but also when reviewing your certified final sales. Christy, you want to talk about this for a little bit?
Yep. So in our study, what you're going to see is that everything is organized by category. So this is the R1 category sample, and we have the span for the first identifier. There's also a reference number, which is just what number it was in the sequence of the sales. Your span is important for you to be able to identify that property, buyer and seller, as well as location. And then your sales price, listed value at time of sale, which we'll talk about more later. And then these are the individual ratios for each sale. So you can look through and see each individual ratio and then get to the total for that category and then for the whole town.
All right.
I
All right.
do have a, yep. I'm all over it here, Deanna.
Gotcha.
So back, Mimi has a question here. She said, I have two sales that have legal and title insurance issues. They were bought sight unseen, no contingencies, because there are major issues with title and boundary lines, and the buyers are being reimbursed or settling with the title insurance. Would those original sales still be considered valid in the 3-year sales study?
Probably not, and we'd certainly want to get some documentation to back that up. Would you agree, Deanna?
Absolutely. So I think the focus, we always focus on the current year's sales or the sales that are most recent, but that is a perfect question of, can we go back and fix something that has been an issue in the past? Prior to being a district advisor, I thought that was, that ship had sailed and you couldn't do that. But having been here for a few years, I realize now that if you have new information about an old sale during a reappraisal or an equalization process, reach out to your district advisor, have a discussion, provide them with that documentation, and we can go back and make adjustments to those prior year sales, even if it's not a reappraisal year.
Yes.
Those are all the questions we have in the chat.
So equalization is then applying those ratios to the town values to convert them to 100% of fair market value. In Vermont, we equalize all towns to 100%. Why do we equalize? So we equalize for fairness so that all towns are equalized to 100%, so that education taxes and education liability amounts are based on all towns being treated equal. And then we also equalize to find the CLA and the COD, which are the common level of appraisal and the coefficient of dispersion.
So what are the CLA and COD used for? The CLA, common level of appraisal, is used to express the overall level or ratio the town is at relative to 100%. This is different from a town ratio that you would get just by comparing listed values to sales. The difference is that we at PVR also apply a ratio adjustment for utility property as well as current use property. And I will just add, the reason that we do that is because our statutory directive from the legislature is to equalize the entire grand list. We have to adjust the entire grand list, not just those properties that sold or those categories of properties that sold. So that includes every single category in your grand list, and that's why we have to do that. And then the COD is used to determine when the town will be mandated to complete a reappraisal. If a COD is over 20, the town will be required to reappraise, and there is no longer any trigger for CLA in terms of reappraisal. It's only COD. But the CLA is super important because it's actually that factor or adjustment that moves all of your numbers to 100% for education liability and also for tax rate purposes.
Right, and I would say, so now we have another trigger that was passed in legislature 2 years ago that is a mandate of a reappraisal every 6 years. Hopefully, we will be closer to having that schedule in 2030. I think that's our goal, Christy, because we know that most towns right now need a reappraisal, and many have already sent in their proposals for finishing that work. I think that I see a question in the chat that I was going to hold off on, but I think it's pertinent here. Is this still important, even though we are going to be reappraising every 6 years? And how would you answer that, Christy?
I'm sorry, can you say it again?
Are these statistical measures still important if we are reappraising or going to be ordered to reappraise every 6 years?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And the reason is exactly what I just said, but I'm going to say it again. The CLA, even if you reappraise tomorrow, right, we're still going to have a judgment of where you're at. You're never going to be exactly at 100%, right? So we're always going to have that adjustment. So it's still super important even the day after, right? Because we're always going to be equalizing. We're always going to need to make you equal to everyone else to make everything fair in terms of education tax. Okay. And then for COD, I would almost argue, and this is probably why it's the only trigger now, COD is even more important because COD is a measure of the fairness from one taxpayer to another, their burden, so to speak. And the way that can be explained is some folks will be assessed even after reappraisal, right? Slightly above fair market value and some below. And the further we get away from a reappraisal, the more that distance between some people paying too much and some people paying too little becomes expanded. And we want things to be more fair and everyone to pay their equal or fair share. That's what the COD is about. And even if we talk about a 6-year schedule, we still want to keep those things in check, right? So that's why it's super important.
Yeah, so it will still be possible to receive an order in between those 6-year cycles. If your
Yes.
COD is showing that your grand list inventory is extremely unequitable, is it likely in our current situation that you'd be able to get another reappraisal before your 6-year limit is up? not in this moment, but we don't know what the future holds, how many contractors are going to be coming into the state, what legislature might do, because they just do what they do. And we play catch up and implement what they tell us the new law is. So there's still absolutely, as Christy said, reason to provide these statistical measures.
So, Deanna, there's another quick note regarding this from Christina. I'm going to just throw it out because here we are. Are you going to talk about the equalization study for revaluation year or in the reappraisal series? If there's more you want to say there, it's right here.
I would say that we will probably touch on a couple of pieces in the context of our next segment after the break, but we will also be holding a specific sales validation training or during that series that's being presented. I believe that'll be towards the end of the series because most reappraisal towns just won't be ready to do that work until that point. Most of the work, if you are doing this for the 3 years leading up to your reappraisal, will already have been done because you've done it, right? Except for those most current sales. The big piece is updating the listed value, the new listed value, to see how that sale price is holding up or that listed price is comparing, and then bringing to the table any new information that you have at that time. But again, yeah, we'll cover that in the reappraisal series itself.
And I
Anything
don't
to add there, Christy?
Yeah, I just don't think the reappraisal series has yet been publicized, so probably folks don't know about it, but we will be doing a several part, I don't know if it's going to be kind of a probably monthly thing, I think is what we designed it to be. Just kind of talking about what reappraisal towns will need to focus on, and that will be by invite to towns that are either reappraising this year or next year, just to kind of keep it limited to specific details for those towns.
Yeah. So for any of you who might be a reappraisal town for this year that's going to be effective for 2025, we'll certainly mention the CAT or the circumstance codes that will be treated a little bit differently when we get there, but it will be explaining that in detail in the series, probably in July.
Yep.
So what are these used for? Because assessments are not updated each year and it is unrealistic to reappraise all properties annually, the CLA is used to adjust the base education tax rates. Oops, I'm getting ahead of myself here. And bring all tax rates to 100%. The CLA is used to adjust use values and current use and land use to 100%. So the caveat here being, we know that legislature made some changes last year, and the CLA is not just directly applied to the rate itself. There are some other maths happening in the background. We won't be able to explain all of that in this segment, but that is the purpose. That CLA is used to adjust in that calculation to make all towns equal or as equal as possible.
Yep. So what is the CLA used for? A CLA over 100% means that in general, the town is assessing properties at more than 100% of fair market value. I don't think we really see much or any of those lately. A CLA under 100% means that in general, the town is assessing properties at less than 100% of fair market value. And this is more common in this market just because we can't possibly keep up with the market, right?
So how is current use handled for equalization? PVR also performs an adjustment for current use each year as part of the equalization study in order to help calculate the hold harmless amount that is paid to the towns for money lost from current use enrollments on municipal rates. This hold harmless amount is for the loss, the loss in education taxes borne by all taxpayers in the entire state. I got ahead of myself there. Another item that is affected by equalization is not so obvious, and that's the county tax. The county tax paid by each municipality is also calculated based on the equalized values produced by this study.
So how do you equalize? Simply put, if your property sold for $200,000 but was assessed by the town at $150,000, we would equalize that $150,000 to 100% for town liability and CLA calculation. Assuming there were only 5 valid sales in the town over 3 years, and this actually happens, it would look like this. So you can see in the grid the listed value at time of sale compared to the sale price. That first one, $150,000 of listed value compared to a $200,000 sale price. Listed value divided by sales price gives you 75% for an individual ratio just on that sale. And then what we do is we use what's called an aggregate ratio, which adds all of the listed values of valid sales up compared to the total of the sale price of all of those valid sales. So total listed value, that's $775,400, divided by total sale price of $955,000 gives you an aggregate ratio of 81:19. And we're just kind of pointing out with the caveat there that there's other statistical measures and adjustments, including that utility and current use. These aren't seen here, but it's simplified for demonstration purposes. So the takeaway here is if you were to go to your study that you probably printed in January, right, that we sent you, you would, if you looked at the back page of that sales report, you would have what's called a town ratio. And you would say to me, Christy, that doesn't make sense. The town ratio is not the same as what I see as a CLA. And the reason is the town ratio is pure sales, and the CLA on your comp sheet includes those adjustments for utility and current use. Okay, so therein lies the difference between a ratio study, which we talked about in the beginning, and an equalization process, which is what we're required to do according to statute.
And one thing that I talk to my towns a lot about when we're reviewing their sales ratio study after the equalization process is that I encourage them to look at the individual ratios to see which ones are really far away from 100%. But this grid right here will show you that even though the lowest ratio here is 50%, that's your first alarm, right? But if you look over to the listed value and the sale price, those are really low dollar amounts. So it's not going to be weighed the same as the ratios that are above because they're cumulative and not just an average of those individual ratios. So it's another piece to keep in mind when you're looking at these things.
Yep.
All right, so with the total listed value of $775,400 in the total sale price of $955 even, we have an overall ag ratio or aggregate ratio of 81.19%, as Christy mentioned. So if we're assuming the town grand list total was $5 million, and then we apply that aggregate ratio of 0.8189, the result is $6,158,393. So that number would be the equalized grand list value representing 100%. Again, there are other statistical measures and adjustments, including utility and current use, that are not seen here. And I'm not sure if we have any questions in the chat. This usually is a hot item.
No, we're gonna hit on some COD questions. You
Okay.
can address COD after this. We do have a question on outliers. Are you getting rid of outliers anymore?
Well, let's talk about that on the next slide,
On the
maybe,
COD,
because we're
yeah.
going to talk about COD here.
Okay. Sounds good.
And
So what is the COD? The short answer is the COD or coefficient of dispersion is the measure of fairness. In other words, some properties in a town are above 100% and some are below 100%, as I mentioned earlier. The COD measures the spread from the high ratio to the low ratio around the middle or median to ensure that assessment levels are reasonably fair and equitable. So you can kind of see here where our curve is going, and the median and where that spread might go, right? And that's measuring, that spread is the measure of what the COD or what the COD is measuring is the spread, high to low around the middle.
And in technical terms, the coefficient of dispersion, and this is a mouthful, a measure of uniformity of appraisals for all properties on the grand list. For example, if a town has valued every property at 100% of fair market value, every property has an assessment to fair market value ratio of 100%, there is zero dispersion because everybody is equal. Similarly, if every property is assessed at 80% of fair market value, there is zero dispersion because everyone is equal at 80%. However, if the town average assessment to sales ratio is 80%, but individual assessments vary markedly, either above or below that average, then the disparity of the assessments will reflect a COD that is greater than zero. Zero is a perfect COD score and indicates absolute fairness insofar as every taxpayer is appraised at the same percentage of fair market value. The higher the number, the greater the dispersion or the disparity in how properties are assessed. Because of market fluctuations, a COD less than 10 is unusual. Statistically, it is the average absolute deviation of a group of numbers from the median expressed as a percentage of the median. Vermont municipalities must reappraise the properties in their town when their COD rises above 20% per VSA, 32 VSA 4041A-B. That was a lot of words, Christy.
Yes, it was.
So now we're going to take a look at the certified final computation sheet that you would review when you review your sales ratio study at the end of the equalization process. And we're going to have some fly-in arrows here looking at the items that we're going to talk about and where to find them. Christy?
Yep, so the first arrows to your left should look very familiar to you from the 411, right? Looks very similar to our 411. We have all of our 15 categories. We next have the property count within those categories, and those should look very similar when you receive yours, right? This is just an example, but they should look very similar to what you have on your 411. And then the education form 411 listed value, again, all these numbers come directly from your 411. Okay. And then you'll see later on what we've applied for a ratio for each of those categories. So we're then taking that applied ratio and dividing the education 411 listed value by the applied ratio to develop what's called the education equalized value. Okay. And then the last two pieces, the arrow there is to 9242. You can see that. That is your common level of appraisal for your town. Okay. You can also see it in the box below. And then your townwide COD is also in that box below at 10.76 in this example. Is there other pieces you wanted me to touch on here, Deanna? I know we go into it deeper when we do other classes specific to equalization.
The only thing that I was going to add is the portion on the left-hand side of this sheet, your category, your property count, your ed form 411, that's going to reflect your August submission to PBR, your statutorily required submission.
Correct.
The only time that those will not match that August submission are if you have significant errors and omissions in your request to submit a new copy to be considered for this purpose, or if there are other factors that Christy will explain, because I'm going to tag her in now.
Right. So if you could, in theory, if you had a major appeal or something that came in late, you could ask for a new 411 to be applied through the appeals process, things like that. There was some sort of error or something like that. And then just because I know it's going to come up in the chat, I'm going to say something about it. This see use column, That is your use values or current use values, the use value amount, right? Which is taken out of the equation, equalized at the prior CLA, and then put back in. Okay, I'm not going to go into the whole math of it, but that's the short answer to the question. We take it out because current use is a year in arrears. We put it back in the equation, equalized at the prior year CLA. Okay, because I know that's going to come up as a question. It probably already is in the chat if I had to guess.
It may be in the chat. I know we talked about when we were planning this particular class that we're going to hold off on teaching that portion of how to
Yep.
read your study until probably late December or January of 2025. But there is a really good recorded version from a prior year, a little bit different because legislature has changed some things, that Terry and Christy did, I think last year or the year before. So if you're really wanting to dig into this now, it is available via pre-recorded webinar on our website, but otherwise look for that class to be coming out towards the end of 2025.
Yep.
All right, and now, if you've printed this out, you'll see that we actually gave you the answer, so we won't spend too much time on this. It was my error this morning. I do apologize. But Beth, if you want to go ahead and read through our quiz questions.
Okay, and do we want to, there are two questions in the chat. One I think is probably already answered. Do we want to do those questions before the quiz?
Sure, why not?
Okay, so just go over maybe in a nutshell the importance of the coefficient of dispersion, the COD.
So I guess I would just ask for that the person who asked the question, if what we had talked about since the question was put in chat answered their questions, because Christy did the kind of the short and sweet version. I gave you the long exhaustive version. We did a little bit of a diagram.
Okay, if it's yeah, could you just put a note in the chat, Pamela, if you feel like that you have a good handle on that. And then the last is, are we getting rid of outliers anymore?
So, yes, possibly. And again, this is I'm gonna answer it succinctly for this purpose, and then we could dig in at a later class. But there is what's called an outlier, which is certain parameters away from the norm statistically. So how far a sale falls away from the norm, right, is considered an outlier statistically. The outliers we tag and we send them a letter, and unless or until they are proven to be not fair market value, they will remain in the study. Okay, but we do question them. And then statistically, further out from an outlier is what's called an extreme. Okay, so those ratios go even further statistically. And those we will remove from the study if we're relying on that ratio that is used. And again, that'll get into more specifics that we go through in the other class. But I would say the answer to the question succinctly is we call outliers into question and we dig further to make sure they're fair market value. And extremes, we likely in most cases will kick them out depending on which ratio is being used.
Thank you. That's it for the chat. So we can go to the equalization quiz. Does a CLA of 110 mean that your town is assessing over or under fair market value? Okay. Do we give the answer here?
Yeah, we'll go ahead and give the answer. We're not, because we already gave it to them in the printed version. We're not going to test you yet, Beth. But yes, so in this case, the answer is that it is over fair market value.
Right. Does a CLA of 86 mean that your town is assessing over or under fair market value?
And in this instance, it means that it's being assessed under fair market value. I'm sorry. I'm thrown off by the fact that the answers are flying in.
I know, right?
And can we just back up? Can we just back up for 1 second? I want to say something about that, right? So our question is very general, right? Does it mean that your town is assessing over fair market value if it's 110? That's in general. That doesn't mean that you don't have some properties that are under 100%.
Right.
It means that in general. So that's where that COD comes in.
Right.
Okay, you certainly can have some that are at 75% and your CLA can still be at 110. Okay, so it's a generally you're assessing over, and same thing goes with the reverse. Generally, if you have an 86, you're assessing under fair market value, but that's not to say you couldn't have some properties that you're assessing at 110, and that's where that COD comes in.
Okay, if a town has a COD above 20, will they be required to reappraise?
Hopefully we've done a good job in letting everyone know that the answer to that question is yes.
And yes, that means even if it's a 20.01.
But if it's a 20.00, it will not get an order. It has to be over 20.
Yes.
I've seen
Yes.
both of those numbers.
Does a CLA under 90 mean that your town will be required to reappraise?
So the answer to that question is no. And the answer to that question is no, because we no longer require reappraisal based on CLA measures.
Does your education tax rate increase or decrease if your town is assessing at 92% of fair market value, absent school spending adjustment?
Our answer is that it will increase. Do you want to explain this one, Christy?
Yeah, so when we talk about equalization, right, and we say your town is at 92%, we're then required to equalize you to 100%, not only during equalization process, but also directly on your tax rate. So it will be applying that 92% to the rates to bring it to 100% and make it fair to everyone. So it would increase it by approximately that difference, or 8%. In this
Right.
case.
Assuming
Go ahead.
assuming that nothing else has changed, right? That's why we're
Yep.
putting that absent school spending.
Exactly. There's many caveats here, school spending, et cetera, right? But this is just that factor alone.
Right.
I'm going to just throw in a quick question from the chat.
Sure.
Since the state doesn't pay the towns enough to cover a 6-year reappraisal cycle, will the taxpayers be paying for it?
Well, so I guess what I would say, every town is different. So some towns have been banking their $850 per parcel for 10 years, and that may be sufficient, depending on the number of parcels in the town. If it is not, then once the town has a contract and a final value, then they can see what that difference will be, including the next couple of years of payments that they're expecting, because that should be pretty easy to estimate. And then anything above and beyond that, hopefully would be split by the budget over the next few years to be covered. Now we're going back to the question of whether or not it would be sufficient for a 6-year cycle. And I think the answer is probably going to be no in most cases, but the hope is, and we've worked on this a few times over the last several years, trying to increase that per parcel payment to the towns. And I think that my guess, my personal opinion as to why that has not increased, is because there's so much uncertainty about what reappraisal is going to look like and how. So now we know it'll be 6 years. There's new pending legislation. We don't know if that's going to gain actual traction or what that'll look like when it's done. But hopefully we will, not this year, but in future years, be effective in getting that increased. The best thing that you can do, talk to your legislators. They are the ones that write the bills. They are the ones that vote on the bills, and informing them is the best course of action. We can only do so much at PVR.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Deanna,
Yeah.
Do you mind if I just jump in really quick and just, you did touch on it briefly, but this is also with this 6-year cycle coming into effect, like an opportune time to be meeting with your select boards and encouraging them to set aside additional funds, like you
Yes.
said, per year to be banking that money. Some towns already do it, some towns don't, and it's a great way to kind of spread it out as opposed to one big lump sum and increasing your tax rate. And I know that's more of a treasurer term than a lister term, but this, I would just encourage you, like, as you're getting contracts and seeing what the costs of these reappraisals are for your town, you have a really good idea right now of how much it's going to cost with some inflation every 6 years. And so working together with your select board to kind of budget that into each year.
Right, good point, Jen. My town, after reappraisal, for example, we decided to put $4,000 a year away in addition to that state per parcel payment. And then as we got closer, we could gauge whether or not we really needed to put that much away or if we needed to put more. So the staggered approach, particularly if you have some overages or underages in your town-wide budget, it's a conversation to have, with your budget committee and your select board.
Right, and I think I would also just add that because I've been around long enough to know, the the intention was not ever for it to fully fund a reappraisal. So there has to be some buy-in and some financial piece that also comes from the town.
Very fair.
Not to say that 850 should not go up, because it certainly should. It hasn't even increased for inflation. But I just want to put that in the back of your mind that that was never really the intention, nor possibly should it be.
And
So, go ahead.
at the risk of getting too far into the weeds, this piece of law was written before there were a significant number of towns contracting out their reappraisal. If you read the statute, it says that once you receive an order, you have 1 year to finish your reappraisal, which for all intents and purposes at that time that it was written meant that the listers, when they went through all of their process and did their inspections, would do a full reappraisal on their own. We don't live in that world anymore. We're probably never going back to that world, but it's just another example of how the language in the law does not keep up with current standards. So that's also another reason why you can use some of those reappraisal funds for things like updating your maps or getting a new computer in order to do the work. Just keep that in mind. And like Christy said, it was never the intent to have that $850 per parcel cover the entirety of the reappraisal cost, because it also updates the municipal grand list and the funds that are coming into the town, or the rate that's used to achieve those funds.
Yep.
So, following the reappraisal train of thought here, Mimi had a 2024 reappraisal. Will she need one in 2030? As we know legislature.
Yes, as we know the law right now, yes.
Whether
Great.
or not Mimi will be able to get a contract for 2030 is the other
Right.
question.
Right.
So many towns just received letters from PVR saying that your last reappraisal is more than 6 years old. You are now under order to start working towards getting your reappraisal. We all
Yes.
know the situation. The director knows the situation. We know that all contractors at this point in time are contracting out till 2029 and 2030. By the time we get to 2030 and those towns are now 6 years out, we don't know what that's going to look like, because we don't know what the potential influx of contractors will look like, or the current contractors that are in place hiring on more staff because they now have a more reliable workload or foreseeable workload. So still have a lot of questions to answer, but we're working through it the best we can. And please believe us when we say we're right there with you and trying to get to the bottom of these questions.
Yep.
Okay. Do you mind? We're kind of moving off of the quiz questions, but I think that the reappraisal questions are coming in pretty steadily. Can we just stay with them?
Sure.
Well,
I'm okay either way.
I would just say maybe a couple because we
Okay.
do have a finite amount of time. We do have Pat Santoso on the other end that's going to be waiting for us to call. And
Yep.
the next portion of our presentation is probably going to take as long as this one. So, and
Yep.
we do have a whole reappraisal series for these particular issues.
Okay, I have kind of two questions. Can we just do those?
Sounds good.
Yes.
Okay, what if your town COD goes over 20 and you're ordered to reappraise, but while you're waiting for the reappraisal, your COD drops below 20? What happens then? Are you still required to reappraise?
Yes, you are. There's no rescind function currently, so you would still be required to reappraise.
Okay, and are statistical reappraisals sufficient, or do you need to do a full reappraisal?
For the 6-year cycle, you need to do a full.
Okay, thank you. That's it for the questions in the chat. Do you want to go on with the quiz questions?
Yeah, I think
Sure.
we just had one left, maybe.
Okay, well, there we go. And the answer's right there. Is a sales ratio study the same thing as equalization? No.
They're
Correct.
similar, but they are not the same.
Yeah, so, just to drive that home a little bit, you in your office might run several sales ratio studies. You might run a sales ratio study for the last 6 months. You might run a sales ratio study for a neighborhood. You might run a sales ratio study for a category, right? Those are all sales ratio studies, similar to the pieces that we put together to form what is known as equalization.
All right, so equalization study and market impacts. As we've experienced in the last few years, the real estate market in Vermont has increased dramatically. Consequently, the town values are lower on average than the selling prices, which means their CLAs are going down.
So what are the takeaways for the equalization study this year? Towns are given the opportunity to appeal their study results each year. The appeal must be received within 35 days of the mailing date of those results. The current appeal period ended January 30th, 2025.
Sorry.
Oops. Many of the towns that are being ordered to reappraise have not conducted a reappraisal in 10 or more years. And I think for me, I'm just going to add the takeaway here, and we're going to drive it home in the next session, is we want you to be aware of what the study means, how important it is, why we do it, and why it's so critically important to spend the time looking at each and every sale, making sure that we got each and every sale, making sure the details are right, and then qualifying those sales in terms of fair market value and arm's length. And that's what we're going to drive home a little more in the next session. But I think those are really the takeaways, is to really spend the time because you understand how important it is.
Looks like we might have another question in the chat before we start on the next segment.
Yes,
More of
I
a-
am.
Do you want to read that, Deanna? It's more of a statement, but discussion certainly.
Okay, happy to, and I'll take a stab at it and then let Christy go from there. So the number of years since last reappraisal is sort of a red herring, Tim says. I suggest that if the CLA and COD have stayed within a good range, then the year since last reappraisal is not particularly relevant. Interesting comment, and I would say before my time at PVR, I probably would have agreed with you. In my experience, I have towns on the Connecticut River that have fewer than 3 sales in any particular year, let alone over the 3-year period. So what we have to do in those instances is provide supplemental appraisals, which means that it's not really a true reflection of their market, but we've had to, for statistical purposes, provide some other information or other appraisals into the system to achieve closer to a statistical confidence interval. On the other end of that spectrum, you might have towns that have 300 or more sales in a given year, so that those sales that are statistically significant won't have the same impact as they would in a smaller town with a smaller sampling. Christy, do you have anything to add to that?
I think that no matter whom you talk to, you would find that any appraisal wants to have a good inventory of all properties. And unless you see and view every property every year, you can't have a good inventory. But the chance that your inventory is dated and inaccurate after 6 years, or certainly even, certainly if you go to 10, the chances that your inventory is incorrect, whether or not we can measure it, is very, very good. The chance that you have either properties that have dilapidated or deteriorated on the outside or inside that you have yet to measure or did not measure because you have had no reason to see them is very good. Or conversely, the chance that there were interior renovations that you either don't have permits for and would affect the fair market value, and you haven't measured because you haven't seen or been in those properties in many, many years, is very good. That would be true whether or not we can measure it or whether or not it shows in the statistics. And I think that that's just a fact that over time, the inventory gets stale.
Thanks, Christy. All right, so thanks for coming back to Equalization Study Sales Validation Training. Again, our presenters today are Christy Wright, our fearless team leader, field director, myself, Deanna Robitaille, district advisor for most of the Northeast Kingdom, and later on we will have Pat Santoso from Catalyst and VT Pi join us for a demo of how to do all the things we're going to talk to you about until he arrives. So what is the equalization study and what is the purpose? I think we probably covered that pretty well in the last segment. This used to be a standalone class, but did you want to touch on any points here, Christy?
I think just driving home that, again, our requirements as a department, as part of the tax department, is to equalize all towns to 100% for the best equation that we can to make assessments and therefore taxation fair and equal to all. That is the purpose of equalization.
All right. And what is fair market value and property assessment? I did read that lengthy description in the last segment, but I will go ahead and read it again here. So generally speaking, property is to be appraised at its fair market value. Fair market value is defined in 32 VSA 3481A as the following. The estimated fair market value of property is the price that the property will bring in the market when offered for sale and purchased by another, taking into consideration all the elements of the availability of the property, its use, maybe its youth also, both potential and prospective, any functional deficiencies, and all other elements such as age and condition which combine to give property a market value. In determining estimated fair market value, the sale price of the property in question is one element to consider, but is not solely determinative. All right, so we are now on, if you've printed out your document, we're on page 2, and we're going to talk about tracking sales. Christy?
Give me 1 second here. Sorry. I'm trying
Sure.
to get something on my screen so I can see a little bit better what's going on and follow you a little bit better. Okay. Okay. So things to know about the study and sales review. And the first thing we talk about is tracking sales, right? So the recommended action when we talk about, and we tried to kind of give you recommended actions for all of these subjects that we're going to talk about, just so you had a little takeaway for each piece. So the recommended action here is to use your CAMA, your computer-assisted mass appraisal, which is where you get your values from, right? Be it Microsolve or ProVal or Patriot, to provide sales and as a tracking mechanism. Or you can use Excel spreadsheets to list all of the sales for your review. Check with your town clerk and or review the most recent land record volumes to ensure that you have all the potential sales. And did I miss the main part of that, Deanna? Because I'm looking at two screens here. I'm sorry. I apologize.
No, you did. I'll just go ahead and review it briefly. So
Yep.
we recommend that you use some type of sales tracking. So when we get to the equalization study results, they should not be a surprise to you. Your CAMA program provides exports for these types of things, of studies. We also have in past years provided an Excel spreadsheet for you to enter your data into. Many of you probably already have them in your town. So go ahead and continue to use those. But then we are also going to use that information in that spreadsheet to be able to garner some information. There's also an export from the VT Pi program that maybe Pat will be able to show you when we get him on. It's very useful to identify, of course, that you have all of the transfers that have existed or occurred in your town over the last year, but particularly the last 3 years, right? Because we're doing a 3-year study. And from that information, you can separate it out by category. You can run all kinds of filters to see what portions of your grand list might be falling away or might need some attention.
Yep. So again, this is no different than the past. Where are you tracking your sales? How are you tracking them? And when you get to the study, how are you making sure that we are accounting for all of the sales that really should be used in your town? That's the important piece here.
All right, so let's move on to item B. We'll talk about market research. You want to talk about market research, Christy?
Sure. I think I'm on the right page now.
Okay.
Having a good understanding of your town's specific real estate market is super important, both before and after a sale occurs. It's very necessary for your job as a lister. So you want to pay attention to those property transfers as they come in and then dig into what's actually selling in your town. Dig in terms of where can I look on real estate appraisal websites, real estate for sale websites, right? To help me not only with the inventory and do I have the inventory right of that property that's sold, but also what's selling in my town and how much is it selling for. Most of these listings will have multiple photos and good property descriptions of the property, especially if you view them before the property is closed. And sometimes after the property is closed, those photos will be removed or shut down. Most sites will allow you to search by town, zip code, and county, etc. And there'll be filters you can put on for different types of searches for closed transactions, pending transactions, properties for sale, etc. So we're just listing a few of those here.
Okay.
Go ahead.
So similar to the sales tracking and getting to an equalization study result that you shouldn't really be super surprised with, the same can be true about what's happening in your market, right? There are so many public sources available to us today that weren't available even 10 or more years ago. Simply going into your Google search or whatever browser you use and type in what's for sale in Montpelier, Vermont. That'll bring up active sales and you can see what has sold, but you should reasonably have that information in your system or in your hands at that point. So you can start to get a sense of what's for sale. You can look through those public pictures that Christy did mention usually fall off once the sale has finished to see if your inventory is good. Particularly after reappraisal, this is an extremely important piece to make sure that the inventory you have remains as current as possible.
And then, you can also, if that site listing has pertinent information and it's helpful for validity, go ahead and print it off, save it in your equalization documentation. Or if vice versa, there's details about it that you want us to consider that might make it not valid, even though it was on MLS. There was $100,000 in personal property that wasn't reflected, for example. You might want to print that out because it specifically said it in the notes, things like that. You can use those resources for not only making sure you have inventory correct, making sure the sale is valid, but also the details of those sales. Okay.
Absolutely. And even more than the pictures themselves, the descriptions usually give a lot of great info because they want to tell their potential customers about the newly renovated kitchens and the newly renovated bathrooms or the recently completed basements that you might not have complete in your grand list. So those listings are an invaluable tool to you.
Yep. Yep. And there's so many resources out there, newspaper ads, local real estate catalogs you can pick up at the grocery store. So many social media platforms you can pay attention to. And like you say, do a search and that will certainly be helpful. And then get used to using some of these websites that'll give you information.
All right. So you are expected to do research when necessary. The state of Vermont does give you $1 per parcel per 32 VSA 5405F. It comes separate from your reappraisal. It might be in the same deposit, but it will be listed as a separate payment. That's equal to $1 for every active parcel in your grand list, not the sales that occur, to help reimburse the town for the time it takes to do this research. So our recommended actions on this are to document all research and opinions on sales validity. This documentation will likely be required at the time of validation. You could consider subscribing to NARIN and MLS. Last we looked, the approximate cost for that was $153 per quarter, and we do provide that phone number in your documentation so you can reach out to them for more information. Anything to add there, Christy?
Yeah, and when you're researching, so as part of this, we talked about how important that was. If you're not doing so already, one of the things that you should consider is a sales verification letter to send to buyers and sellers so that you can find out more about the sale. That's specifically why we do it, all the parameters of a sale. And it's good for you, not only for equalization, but also for reappraisal purposes, to dig in and find out more of the pieces and information about transactions that happen in your town. You can also look at the deeds, certainly, you know. You can talk to buyers and sellers, talk to the new owners after a sale. Get on the phone if there's a question. Talk to the realtor. What were the extenuating circumstances here? This doesn't quite look right to me. Those kind of things. Certainly, if you were to talk to someone on the phone, such as a realtor, and they gave you information about a sale, document it. Put it in your save a folder about equalization and document it and put it right in there, who you spoke to, when it was, and what they told you about the sale.
All right, and I just want to say before we move on, thank you to Deborah Kay. She said that picket fence preview, she hasn't seen those in a while, and also suggested some other resources for us to add to the documentation, but also for the folks in the chat that might want to make a note. She included Airbnb, VRBO, HipCamp, ooh, I like that one, and Redfin are also good resources.
Yep.
All right. So arm's length transactions, we did talk about that in pretty good length in the last section, but is there anything you wanted to add about arm's length transactions, Christy?
So again, I would just hammer home arm's length means that there's no extenuating circumstances. There's none of these things that would make the property sales price not valid. In other words, the sale was to unrelated parties. There was no undue influences. It was a typical sales price and they weren't under any undue pressure to buy or sell. Okay. Those are the kinds of things that we're looking for. We want to only reflect valid or arm's length transactions in your study so that we can make it the most accurate reflection of truly where your listing percentage is at. Okay, we're trying to measure that in an accurate way, and the way that we do that is to get the best and most valid sales included in the study. And it's really one of the most important jobs that you're going to do. And as we mentioned before, it does affect not only equalization, which when we talk about equalizing, that's going to go to the education department for the liability for your town for education liability, how much you have to spend and send to educate the students within your town, right? So it affects that, and it also directly affects your tax rate. So I can't hammer home hard enough how important it is and how monetarily important it is for your town. So spending the time on it is really crucial. And if you need to, go to your select board, maybe this is a great way to sell it that I need some more time. I got to have more time so I can really study our sales so that I can do better on the equalization study and make sure that's reflective because it costs our town money.
All right, let's do a couple more. I don't see too much activity in the chat yet. So provide documentation. We've talked about this a little bit so far, but the recommended action here is to utilize the attachment feature in VTPie to share any documentation that supports your opinion. Do you want to talk about what types of documentation we might be looking for, Christy?
Yeah, so I just talked about that note that you might have, simply that you talked to the realtor and the realtor explained that there was a 20-year note where the seller provided financing at 0%. So that's a great example of something that might affect the sales price, and certainly therefore we would want to know about that. And you might want to put that in as an attachment, right? I kept notes on this. This was the date. This is who I talked to. This is what they verified. That's the kind of information we want to know. If you had something from MLS, you could attach it to the sale so that we know. When you give us something and it's simply just a statement without any documentation, we are either going to ask you for more documentation if it's not clear, or we're going to have to go out and try to do the research on our own and get what we can get. So again, if we're all working together towards a better product, the more we can get up front and get this documentation, the easier and the quicker it's going to be for us to get good results.
Yeah. And I think we go into pretty good detail about the types of documentation based on the type of circumstance code. So we'll leave that there for now.
Yeah,
but
and we will talk about how to attach that, which is actually the recommendation here. Utilizing the attachment feature, we're actually going to show you how to do that and how you could attach a document for us within your sales study.
And if anybody is looking for some light reading, there is a reference on page 3 of your document in section E, sending you to IAAO.org website. And if you look up standards on valuation and adjustment of sales, it will give you a good explanation of what we're doing and why we're doing what we're doing. It's not just something that's specific to Vermont. There are standards that are international.
Yep, exactly.
That one flew in differently. Sales verification letters, you did touch on that a little while ago, Christine. We're going to have a sample come up here on the screen in just a moment. So while we have the ability to send sales verification letters when the sale reaches us at PVR, we always highly encourage towns to do their own version of a sales verification letter as soon as possible to, or as close as possible to the date of that transaction. We know that the sellers are most likely moving away. They probably have some forwarding orders that will expire after 6 months unless they renew them. So the likelihood of getting good information is going to happen more closely to the sale than when we see it at PVR. If you don't get a response to your sales verification letters, then certainly send one. You can click that off yourself. We'll show you that in the third segment. Or send us a note saying, hey, something just doesn't look right. If you think this needs another letter, go ahead and send one. I found that some town sales verification letters are a little bit different than what the buyer or seller might disclose to the state. So it's not always a bad idea, particularly if something just doesn't feel quite right. So the recommended action there, if you do not receive your sales verification letters back or believe the information is incomplete, consider reaching out to the broker, an attorney, the appraiser that's listed in the MLS if you have access, the buyer and or seller for more information. Anything to add there, Christy?
I think, yeah, the really important part when you talk about sales verification forms is the wording on the questions. So if you're not getting good or clear results, think about how you're wording the questions and whether or not it's meaningful and understandable to a buyer and seller. right? And then the second piece that you could add in is you could consider adding some sort of warm fuzzy or welcome to your town and give them resources about your town with the letter, as well as a self-addressed stamped envelope so that you're more likely to get a return.
All right, and so we do have the most recent edited version of what we can provide to you as a template. You'll notice that number 13, if you do have sales verification forms you're currently using, that was not there previously. And that was to talk, I'm sorry, we have two 13s. So the first number 13 is asking whether or not we have concessions, and we'll fix that before we send it out to anybody who asks for it. The other piece with concessions is that the buyer and seller don't always know what we mean by concessions. So
Right.
they think that if they came down $10,000 on their sale price, which isn't very likely in the current market, but certainly in previous years, that they think that's a concession. But what are we talking about here in terms of concessions, Christy?
So concessions are something typically that's going to be arranged at the closing. For example, the seller will provide $2,000 to the buyer at closing towards closing costs. Okay, that's an example of a concession, right? Negotiation on sale price is not a concession. Another example I've seen is seller will provide buyer $5,000 towards the replacement of the septic system at closing. Okay, that's the kind of thing that you might see that would be considered a concession as opposed to negotiating a sales price, which is entirely different. And that's where folks get confused.
All right. And I would say that I can take a quick minute to read through these questions. They're available to you in your documentation, but we're not going to spend time on them because we're going to cover all of these in our special circumstances codes in just a minute. So questions that we ask at the state level and recommend that you ask, and you can edit them for your market because like we said, every market is different. Was the sale between family members or close friends? Did the sale involve a trade, a like-kind exchange, or a debt payment? Was the property rented, leased, or occupied by you, the buyer, before the sale? So not so relevant to the seller because hopefully they were, 9 times out of 10, they were living there. Was this a distress sale? Did the sale occur as a result of divorce, an estate, a court decree, financial hardship, or something else that forced the hand of the seller to put it on the market and hand it over to someone else? Were any back taxes, liens, etc., included in the sale price? Were any substantial changes made to the property just before the sale? Did the seller provide any mortgage financing? So Christy touched on that a little while ago. So if they financed 100% of the sale price, which is not typical in today's market, and they financed it at a 20% rate, that's not a typical interest rate, or there was a balloon payment, and we'll talk about those in a little bit. Was an appraisal done on the property for this purchase? Do you feel that the sale price reflects fair market value? I would say on this one, it's really funny that usually the seller is happy in this market and the buyer doesn't think it's fair market value. So take those with a
Right.
grain of salt. Was any personal property included in the sale? How many properties did you look at before selling this one? This seems like an odd question, but we also want to gauge whether or not the seller was on the open market or if they really had just one particular market or one particular house in mind when they purchased, because that could also indicate whether or not it's truly arm's length. That would put the seller at a significant advantage over that buyer.
Yep.
We talked about the concessions piece, and then was the final piece negotiated? Anything there on that form before we move on, Christy?
I think you forgot number 4, which is the property abutting a parcel that was already owned by you? So the buyer is purchasing a property next to what they already own. And in our most recent version that we send out, it adds a line for address of their current parcel so that we can verify.
And this one, traditionally the definition, so to speak, of a butter is right next door, but if it's just slightly removed 1 or 2 parcels away and that may have influenced their purchase of that property, that may also be considered an abutting sale.
Yeah.
So
All right.
there are a couple of questions in the chat regarding the sales verification letter. Do you want to take those now or at the break?
About the sales verification letter itself, absolutely. If it's about the individual questions, let's go ahead and take those when we get to that topic.
Okay. So for the letter, would you send a letter to every sale or just the ones that look odd?
I believe every.
Okay.
So I would agree with that, and I just expand a little bit in that a lot of towns or a lot of listers in my experience look at the ratio of that sale price to listed value, and if it's close, they don't question it. In this particular market, we know if it's close and you haven't reappraised in 10 or more years, it's probably questionable. So until you start to see those trends, it's hard to identify what is truly questionable. If it's absolutely an invalid sale from a parent to a child, and there's no consideration, or it's 50% of the listed value, then that's not something that necessarily requires a sales verification letter. But it's
Right.
also really hard to make those determinations. So if you want to treat everybody the same and just have a simple process and send them out to everybody, that's not wrong either.
Yeah. If you're going through property transfers and you see something that we would clearly throw out and you probably wouldn't even ever see it because they didn't even pay transfer tax at all, that kind of thing, then maybe you don't send letters to those. Like, an easement or things like that. You don't want to have to send letters on every single thing, but every other thing that's possibly remotely valid or remotely invalid, I would say yes. And then you can't be accused of, picking and choosing either.
Right.
Okay. There's a couple of comments, not questions, from
Okay.
Kenneth on the template for parcel or span number area of last 5 numbers. That should say last 5 numbers of span, because the last 5 numbers of a typical parcel ID will be useless. And then Deb states, while I appreciate the form, I honestly feel that folks would consider this an invasion of privacy and most likely not return. Just my thoughts. And then Tina says, I always send a letter out and find them helpful. I've gotten more than one stating that it was none of my business. 90% of them I do get back.
Yeah,
And
I
then,
mean, we get the off-color remarks as well. But you have to take that with a grain of salt, right? We're going for the bigger picture, and if I can make my study better in any way, then it's worth taking a little bit of flack from folks if they don't understand what it's for.
right.
And I'm going to do the best that I can in my marketing and in my explanation letter to explain to folks why I'm doing it and why I need to know.
Right, which is Lois's point. She sends a cover letter, which
Yep.
she can share, and she gets a great response.
Yeah,
Good.
I think the cover letter is a really important piece. The tax department also sends a cover letter explaining why we're looking for this information and being very clear that it doesn't change their tax bill directly. I mean, if
Yep.
it changes the CLA, it could, but that's on the other end of the spectrum. And also that it's not going to affect the sale itself, well, like their ownership of that property. This is purely for honing in on the appropriate common level of appraisal to assign an appropriate tax rate, even though none of us like to pay taxes. It's just a fact of life. We have to do that. And to gauge whether or not there is equity in your grand list. Are we going to make taxpayers understand all of the stuff that we're trying to explain to you here in this class? Probably not. But the resources are there if you wanted to share it with them. But you're always going to get those kind of off the cuff remarks about not your business, or such and such politician rose the taxes and I had to sell my home because I couldn't afford it anymore. Those types of things. It's human nature. But I would say probably 9 times out of 10 that the information we receive on our letters is actually helpful.
Okay, just a couple other comments, good comments, including a return envelope, a stamped address return envelope has been helpful for some towns. And then the note that Patriot Access Pro CAMA has a new document merge that makes sending the letters out pretty simple and personalized. So
Perfect. Good.
Yeah.
Very neat. Okay. All right, so listed value at the time of sale. Christy, would you like to talk about this one?
Sure. So Patrick will show you later in the actual sales screen, but what we're looking at, if you are not a reappraisal town, okay, all other towns that are not reappraising this year, we are going to be looking at listed value at time of sale. Okay, and that's also stands for the category at time of sale. So in the sales verification validation screen, we're going to be looking at that field that says listed value ATS at time of sale. Okay, and we want it to reflect the listed value and category in the grand list at the time of sale. In other words, in the prior year's grand list, because you're looking at 1 year of sales and we're looking to the prior year grand list to say what was it listed value at the time it sold. For example, sales from 4/1/24 to 3/31/25, which is the ones that you're going to see if you're not a reappraisal town. If you're a reappraisal town, you'll see 3 years of sales. Otherwise, you're only going to see the one this year, should correspond to the listed value in the 2024 grand list. Okay, and the recommended action there is to review the listed value at time of sale on each sale to ensure the correct values are being compared. Listed value and category at time of sale. Okay, and then the note there is also that for towns that are completing their reappraisal in the current grand list, you will look at the current grand list value, not listed value at time of sale, and you will be comparing that to the sales price, because in a reappraisal year, everything's a little bit different, and we'll cover that in a separate training for reappraisal towns.
All right. So comments in VT Pi. So we definitely recommend that you use the comment field in the verification screen to provide us relevant information. So what do we consider relevant? So we do enjoy a good municipal, local story. Is it efficient? Is it an efficient use of your time and ours? Probably not. Maybe we can chat about it when we come and visit you for our spring or fall visits with your DA. But essentially what we're looking for here is a very succinct comment that explains to us why you believe a sale might be invalid, and that will correspond with one of the codes that we're going to talk about in just a few minutes. You may also want to use this for a sale that might look like it's not a valid sale on its face, but you know that it is valid. So we're not just going to use comments for things that are invalid. We also use them for things that just don't quite look like they're correct, but really should be included. That way the district advisor isn't having to question you later on in the process. Anything to add there, Christy?
Yeah, I mean, I would just say this is an efficiency factor, because if you think about the fact that district advisors have thousands of sales they're looking through, if they have to read a paragraph for every sale, it's not going to make for an efficient process. And then I have to review all of theirs, which amounts to 10,000 sales plus. So the more succinct you can make it, the more likely we're going to be able to read and absorb what you're trying to tell us and put across. The longer it is, the less likely we're going to get it through and understand what you're putting out there. So again, just a quick short comment that will get through to us what we need to know about that sale. And also, conversely, if there's nothing to say about the sale, if you say nothing, it's a valid sale and I can move on very quickly.
Absolutely. Grievance values, one of our favorite conversations to have when we're talking about sales study review. Christy, would you like to talk about this?
Sure. So this is a tricky one, and I'm probably going to get some comments on it, but we'll go with that. Grievance values. We do not accept grievance values or grievance changes in our equalization study as a reason to invalidate a sale or as a way or reason to reduce the listed value at time of sale. And the reason for that is we need to measure what it was at the time and your general listing practices for everybody. If we were to take into account grievance results, then we're not reflecting how you're assessing everyone that might be similar. That's why we don't take them. So we're still going to use the listed value at time of sale, even if they came into grievance that year and you changed it. Okay. Now, having said that, there might be varying circumstances where you didn't know that they removed a barn. Okay. That's going to come under a different scenario, but we're still not going to take your grievance results. We're going to then reflect it in a different way and say, oh, okay, so was it a large change? Okay, then let's talk about that, right? It's a different thing. So I think an example we have here is the buyer purchased the house on February 1st of 2024. The property had some deferred maintenance that was not reflected in the listed value. During annual grievance period, the new owner grieved the value and it was reduced by $15,000. The new reduced value cannot be used as listed value at time of sale because it was not acknowledged until the following year and is reflective of the general equity of the grand list.
All right. Do we want to move on to mobile home parks? Usually that one gets a few, not seeing anything, but we can cover that in greater detail when we get to large change.
Yep.
So mobile home parks, all sales to or from a mobile park home owner are removed as a number 19 that we'll discuss later on. Why are these removed, Christy?
So typically what's happening with these is the person who owns the mobile home that sits in the park could, for example, owe back lot rent, right? So they just sell back to the owner of the mobile home park. It's easier for them because they want to get out of it quickly, so they sell back to the owner of the mobile home park. The mobile home park, conversely, might sell at higher or lesser than and can make deals for when they turn around and sell it to people that might come into their park. So there's so many variables. We just kick them out as a general rule when it's from or to a mobile home park owner.
Right. And I think that's the important distinction there. We're not saying that mobile home sales themselves are invalid, but if it's from a mobile home owner to the owner of the park on which it's sitting, then that's not
Yes.
going to be a valid sale.
Yes, correct.
All right. And I think we have one more before we'll take more questions. So
Okay.
relocation company sales. There are businesses out there that hire relocation companies to buy and sell real estate when employees relocate as a benefit to their employees. The relocation company typically buys the property and then resells it. Their intentions and incentives are not necessarily market driven, therefore we eliminate these sales from the study. Anything to add there, Christy?
I think you got it.
That's good because I read it right from the document. It was short and sweet. All right. So before we start talking about the category or the special circumstance codes themselves, do we have any more questions or comments in the chat?
We do. I'm going to go back to, let me see here, 1042. One we didn't touch on, Linda comments, what about research done by the Warren Group for Sales Review? Just bringing that from quite a while ago. The Warren Group.
Yeah, I guess so. I'm familiar with the Warren Group request. I had to deal with that when I was on the municipal side of the house. I'm not sure how that would impact the sales study in your review. Christy, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'm not sure either. I think they're looking for data to get from you to possibly resell to other entities for sales research, but I'm not aware, unless I'm missing something, I'm not aware of them giving information back that might qualify sales, but maybe I'm missing something.
Okay. So just going back to the letters, sending out the sales verification letters, the note that a welcome to town, probably softens a lot of the a lot of the correspondence that's put out there by Tina, and she has a bunch of canned letters on her desktop that helps her out. Okay, Pamela, we don't adjust for deferred maintenance because that should be reflected in the purchase price or through concessions. So I don't know if Christy or Deanna, you want to comment on that? It's not a question, it's a comment.
I think that person might be confused by what I said, and I apologize. So when we were talking about that example, the person came into grievance, right? And they were talking about your listed value and whether or not that reflected deferred maintenance. So now in this market, it's hard to see, right? And I think that's where you're going with it, is that maybe they didn't pay less even though it was there. But we may, in fact, have situations where they did pay less and they're trying to say to you, it's because I have more deferred maintenance than you know about. So perhaps that one's a little hard to envision in this market, but I can see where you're going with that.
Yeah, and I think the general comment itself, Christy, is relevant. So
Right.
when we're talking about deferred maintenance, we don't, in the middle of or in between reappraisals, we don't tell folks as standard practice to go out and assess deferred maintenance in between reappraisal, right? We're trying to capture what the property was at the time of sale. I'm sorry, what the property was at the time of reappraisal and what depreciation does that really apply to the property?
Right.
So if you have zoning and they add an addition, so they're on your re-inspect list, you go out, you measure their little 10 by 10 addition to their kitchen or what have you, and you notice that failing 3-tab shingled roof is now a standing seam roof. You're going to update that information in your program, and you're going to maybe consider whether or not that affects the depreciation. Is that a fair statement, Christy?
Yes, it absolutely is.
Okay.
And I think sometimes where we get lost is we're so set on the fact that we have a reappraisal and we have to stick to it that we forget when a person comes in, we got to look at that property all anew, right? I don't care if I had a reappraisal in 2004, right? Way back, okay? If someone comes in 20 years later and they say to me, listen, you got to look at this. My property's not the same. Now I've got to put my blinders on because now I'm at grievance and I got to say, what is the fair market value of that property on April 1st of 2025? And does it make it so that I may be inequitable with other properties? Absolutely. Hence the reason why we need reappraisal more often.
Right.
You start chipping away at the equity, the more you address those things, which you have to address when someone comes in, because if they can prove it, then they're right. Right? Now we've put our blinders on, we've considered them differently, and therefore we could possibly be chipping away at our equity.
Absolutely. So annual maintenance, just try to make this more simple. Annual maintenance, you're going out, you're doing permits, you're going to capture the value as it would have been reflected at the time of your last reappraisal. The moment someone comes in to grieve their value, they're grieving the value based on April 1st of that year. And they're going to grieve one of two things. They're going to grieve whether or not they believe they're being treated fairly compared to their neighbors. Is it equitable? Or that they don't believe the value is reflective of the market. In this market, they'd probably be cutting themselves or doing themselves a disservice because the market value is much higher than most listed values right now. But in a market that has the sale prices coming in lower than listed value, it's more common that a taxpayer will come in and say, I think my property is assessed too high. Let's talk about the specifics.
Yeah.
But again, that's going to be in the current year. Everything else that you do for annual maintenance is going to be based on the time of your last reappraisal. And you can expect that as you get further away from reappraisal, it's really hard to do that.
Yeah. Yep.
Okay, a few more things to say in the chat. I do see that Pat has put a note in that he's here.
Okay, good.
Okay, so let me just run through. Gordon states that he gets better information from realtors that he knows and works with daily. He's not had good luck with the letters. That may be because they have a large second homeowner population, and these experienced property buyers perceive the letter as a way for him to get information and try to come in and raise their assessment.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, you do the best you can. You may get a good percentage and you may not, and we may be able to get what you can't. So if there's a few that you think are super suspect, then we want to be able to do that as well.
Okay. And Tina asks, does the mobile home have to be in a park, or can it stand alone and not be valid?
Well, it could not be valid for other reasons, but you'd have to prove what those reasons are. We're saying specifically there is a code for mobile home park owners buying or selling, right? We want those to go out without any other further justification. If you have a mobile home sale that you think is invalid, then it needs more justification than just that.
Okay.
Okay, does that make sense?
Last comment here. At one time, we could invalidate a sale. Oops, hold on a second. If there had been upgrades done within a certain period of time that changed the price by 10%.
We'll talk about that.
Okay, and I believe that Patrick has a question.
Okay.
Yeah.
No, I just needed him to raise his hand so I could get him situated.
Okay.
So he's okay. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, so we're all set then.
All right, awesome. Thank you, Beth.
Sure.
All right, so now we're going to talk about, well, we've been talking about valid sales. So valid sales are sales believed to be valid for the purposes of this equalization study review. And they require few of any notes. So as Christy mentioned, if she doesn't see a comment in a sale that the ratio seems reasonable for your market, we see a ratio on your side, it's a little extra tool that we get, then if everything looks good to her, we can skip past a little more easily than we can with the ones that look a little weird or have lengthy comments.
Yep.
We're all pretty familiar with those. So now let's talk about reasons that sales might be invalid. So you'll see codes, or you may not see them in your system, but if you do, 1 through 7 are typically eliminated by PVR. They're going to be eliminated based on what the attorney entered on the PTTR and the parameters of that sale. Whether or not that PTTR was filled out correctly, we all know that that's probably hit or miss. So it is going to be reasonable for you to review your pre-excluded sales report that Pat will show you in the system, review your PTTR book, or however you manage those in your office, to make sure that every sale that should be in the study for consideration has made it there, with the exception of the one that slips through most often are timeshares. So you may need to utilize special circumstance number 4 if you have a timeshare that slips through those cracks, because those sales are for transfers for a set period of time to a property versus a fee simple ownership or a full bundle of rights. Anything to add there, Christy?
I know that we have had certainly on appeal some sales that have been found that should have been included that were in that pre-excluded. So really look through that and make sure that we've got them all. It could be something as simple as the attorney at closing or whatever, something was coded incorrectly that cued our system that it wouldn't be a valid sale. So it does happen, and I just want to put that out there to really check that.
Right. The other thing that I want to hit home is that if you have paper PTTRs that come through your office, so these are going to happen for any attorney that does fewer than 5 transactions in a year, or if it's from one party to another and they don't hire an attorney, they're going to fill out a paper PTTR form. If those forms make their way to you, but then don't get forwarded by your town clerk to the tax department, or they get lost in the mail, because that happens, then we need for you to notify us to get that information into the program so we can determine the validity.
Yep. And we've also found those on appeal recently too.
Okay.
Christy, Indiana, can I also just quickly chime in that it's really important for your town clerk to complete their PTTRs timely, because if they
Yes.
wait too long, they miss getting imported into the VTPI system. And so you might be looking for a PTTR that you have in your office that's not in our system because they never completed it on the VTAX system.
Yep.
So I know that listers don't always do that, but it's important to communicate with your clerk to get that stuff done.
Yeah, particularly March, working towards March and almost into April, just kind of bug them and say, are we going to be caught up, and can we make sure that we're really, really caught up as of April 1?
Absolutely. To add to that, I always, err on the side of caution with town clerks, having been one for a long time before my tenure at PVR. The beginning of the year is really tough. They're getting ready for budgets and town meeting and town reports. And then we had an election year last year. So, any number of reasons could happen. So maybe there's a turnover, maybe there's an illness. So even if the PTTR makes its way to you, the clerk still has a piece that they need to do in the My VTax program. But one of the best things that you can do to combat that, or missing those, is to once a week or every few weeks go and take a look at their day book, which is their log of incoming recordings that are yet to be recorded. And then also grab the land record volume, the most recent one, or even the one before if it's a new, and see if there are any deeds and PTTRs that are recorded there that might not have made their way to you. That's going to save you a lot of headaches. I had a poor lister that received like 5 or 6 life estate deeds and PTTRs late in the year. We're talking like October, because there were some things happening on the other side of that office that they weren't aware of. So do yourself a service and avoid those errors and omissions and those changes to your grand list by keeping an eye on those land record volumes and the day book if you can.
Yep. And if you don't know what that means or how to use them, go ask the clerk when they're not busy. Can you show me how these things work so that I can just be checking them as we go along?
Yep. And if they have electronic records in your town, ask them to give you a username and password, and then it'll be much easier for both of you. All right, so moving on to special circumstance code number 8, we're talking about family sales. We talked about this a little bit already, but especially for buyers and sellers with different last names, please don't just say family. We need you to state the relationship, father to son, first cousins, stepmother, stepson, marriage, etc. Anything else you want to add here, Christy?
The only other thing is ask other parties if you're not sure. Oftentimes the clerks are very useful resources for that because they likely know a lot of people in town, so they may know if you don't.
Yep. And so it's not just the family code that's indicated on the PTTR that might invalidate the sale, right? Because there are only so many relationships that will stop them from having to pay the transfer tax, but that's a different purpose, right? Now we're talking about the validity.
Yeah, so they very well could be family and still have to pay transfer tax because they're not immediate enough family, but that doesn't mean it didn't affect the sale.
All right, and then we have just a short wording example in your document. Family sale, buyer, the wife is the niece of the sellers. So some doesn't have to be too lengthy, but if you could give us something, particularly if the last names are different. I personally had a sale one year that it was from a Smith to a Smith, and they were not related. So
yeah, that happens too.
Yep. All right, Christy, you want to talk about number 9?
Sure. So the number 9 special circumstance code is specifically for corporation and stockholder information. So what we mean here is, did the owner of a corporation sell to one of the principals of that organization, right? Or were they a stockholder that sold back to the corporation of which they were a stockholder? So there was a relationship there that brought the sale into question. And the way that you can verify that is most states have, similar to Vermont, they have a Secretary of State website or equivalent where you can look up corporation names, and then within that corporation name, you can find out who the principals are of that corporation. And if those names are recurring, right, or those are your parties, then you know that, hey, they were the principal of this corporation and they sold back to the corporation. So that's got to be suspect, right? That's got to be something's going on here, and that explains why it was a lesser sale price or whatever.
Right. And some of you, if you use that Secretary of State's website often, might have noticed that their page has been updated. They're using a new platform. So I've given you in the document a snip of what that now looks like. Same information, just a little bit different visual. I have heard from some folks that it requires you to register. And that is true if you use the link that's in the document. And I apologize for not updating that to the most current link. But you can find this if you want to jot this down real quick. If you go to the Vermont Secretary of State's webpage and you select Business Services at the top of their screen, then you will select Businesses, which is, as you scroll down, you'll see an option for businesses. And then there's a search section that brings you to this page. I'll just give them a couple of minutes to write that down, or say 30 seconds.
And while we've got that, I've got a comment that if the owner of the corporation is out of state, it's often hard to find. Also, a few states require some payment to obtain the information.
I agree, and maybe that's where you use a letter instead. You know, this might just be a shortcut, but maybe you need a letter instead in those scenarios. Harder to find out, harder for us as well.
All right. We'll keep going. Do we have any questions on the first few category codes or circumstance codes that we've issued so far?
There are no questions in the chat.
Okay. All right, so this is a fun one because there's lots of words here. So auctions, foreclosures, bank property liquidation, tax sales, sheriff sales, bankruptcy, receiverships. We know that with the, Jay Peak and Burke Mountain, there are some receivership issues that are going on in this particular area, maybe other areas as well, maybe not related. And then dissolutions or liquidation sales. So documentation might include a printed auction notice, deed pages mentioning a foreclosure, maybe not even deed pages, maybe threats of foreclosure that are recorded in those land record books. Another really good reason to keep yourselves familiar with the land records. Delinquent tax history prior to the sale, wording, particular wording in the PTTR, marketing an MLS that will indicate that there's that type of duress, or a town sales verification letter stating a liquidation situation. Anything to add there, Christy?
I think you got it.
So a wording example for this would be a liquidation or short sale. The seller was under financial duress and could not afford to keep the property. Delinquent tax report for the past 2 years is available. Or if you want to be proactive and attach it, you're more than welcome to do that too. It'll help save us the phone call and an extra effort on the other end. So some other wording examples that we have are an auction sale, copy of auction notice available for viewing or attached, and bank foreclosure per deed or CPTTR wording, or complaint of foreclosure on file.
And for our purposes, we exclude bank sales either way. So in other words, when the bank takes it back or when the bank turns around and sells it, you could make the argument for your purposes that when the bank sells it, perhaps it's reflecting fair market value, but we have to have a one size fits all. And it's more likely that their bank interest is only recouping what they need to recoup. So we do not include them if it's from a bank either way.
Right. Another important thing to remember about foreclosures, they might not always be obvious. It's not always going to be from the owner to a bank. There
Correct.
are legal processes which don't require that bank to file a new deed until they've offloaded it to someone else, whether it's a holding company or another taxpayer that's intending to utilize that property. So again, another reason to be familiar with those land record books, because you might never see those complaints of foreclosure and it might look like a good sale, but there could have been duress there.
Yep, exactly.
How about estate sales, Christy?
So a estate sale is a sale by or to guardians, trustees, executors, or administrators, and should often, and you'll see bold, but not always, be labeled as invalid. If you're not sure, you should send out a sales verification form. So just because it's sold by an estate does not mean it doesn't bring fair market value. Okay? If it was marketed, if it's in line with other sales, it could be included in the study. If the sale price was affected and you know that and can show that and it was an estate, then we want to take them out. Sometimes what I've seen is if a town just sees the word trustee or estate, they automatically kick it out. What we want you to do is dig a little deeper than that.
And if you don't dig a little deeper than that and we dig on our end, that's probably why it's showing as a valid sale in the result of the study.
Yep.
Government sales are pretty straightforward. We're talking about sales to or from the US government, state of Vermont, or any political subdivision of Vermont, such as a municipality, will not be included in the study. That also includes school districts.
Yep.
How about number 13, Christy?
Okay, so this one is charity, religious, and benevolent. So it can include sales from churches, religious organizations, and nonprofit organizations. And again, I'm going to caution you on this one. Just because a nonprofit sold it doesn't necessarily mean that it's not fair market value. You got to dig a little deeper. So you can go to one of the websites that we've listed here, also to show you if in fact it was a nonprofit, right? The business search will tell you, and that's also on the Secretary of State's website, if it's a nonprofit. Again, could mean that they're gifting a portion of it or they were gifted a portion of it, but you might need to dig a little further than just say to us nonprofit, right? Doesn't necessarily mean that that sale is not good.
All right, and I apologize, when reviewing this document or PowerPoint, I didn't update the wording example, so it doesn't match your document quite exactly, but from your document on page number 9, as an example, we have buyer is a charitable organization and receive the property as a gift, CPTTR.
Yep.
Let's see. You may have mentioned this, Christy, but most states have their own version of this business lookup. So if they're from out of the state, don't feel like you have to throw your hands up. And even with owners in Canada, because I'm on the Canadian border, so we have a lot of Canadians buying and selling property in our area. If you search the LLC and just put in Quebec or Canada, you may find their LLC filings up there as well. So unusual financing. These are sales where financing is significantly affecting the sale price. Cash financing or owner financing may not necessarily invalidate the sale. So we've touched on this before in both the previous segments. My example is if they are financing 100% of the sale price. Before the housing crash in 2008, that was not unusual. It is unusual now. If the current interest rate or the interest rate at the time of the sale was 6.5%, but they're giving them 0% or 15%, neither of those are typical. That's going to be unusual. Or if there's any mention of a balloon payment. So they're going to make regular payments for, say, 5 years, and then the remaining balance is due all at once. Those are examples of unusual financing. Anything that you wanted to add there, Christy?
Yep, and then our other example there is a 1031 exchange, and it should say that right on the PTTR, there's 1031 exchange. Perhaps not, hence the reason for the sales verification form. So those are an investment change of where they're basically swapping an amount of fair market value for another property of similar or like. So we like to take those out because they're not straight up fair market value transactions.
Right. So I feel like I'm repeating myself and I apologize. Yet another example of why you want to familiarize yourself with the land records.
Yeah.
If there is owner financing and it's being given in the form of a mortgage, sometimes you'll have a rent to own situation that won't apply here. But if there is a lien on the property, that lien is going to be the next document recorded after the deed. So even if the PTTR itself doesn't say owner financing, it might say other or might be blank. Look in the land records and you'll at least be able to identify that there's a mortgage. It's not going to give you the terms, but it will be another reason for that light bulb to say, hey, let's go ahead and send that sales verification letter or make that phone call. How are we doing on questions, Beth?
We have two comments. So Linda in Lunenburg would appreciate anyone with cover letters for sales verification letters. Could they be sent to her at her email address, which is in the chat? And Linda, you might also put that request out on the Comp 60.
Yep.
And then Lois says nonprofit is different from not for profit. And I don't know if you want to speak to that, Christy or Deanna.
I'm going to leave that delineation in the proof, and we'll leave it there.
And so we're set.
Okay. All right. So partial interest. You want to talk about this one, Christy?
Sure. So the important part about this code is that this is not the same thing as a subdivision. A subdivision is a part of a property. What we're talking about here is a partial interest in a property, a partial ownership, or a part of the legal rights or bundle of rights that we might think about. So things that would be coded here would be things like a life estate and interest was being transferred, development rights, right of ways, that kind of thing. It would also be applicable to a divorce situation where a husband or wife is relinquishing their interest in the property to the other party. Or you have 5 brothers or sisters that own together and one is relinquishing their interest in the property to the others. That would be a situation where we would code it a number 15. And our example there talks about large co-ownership, such as ski clubs or camps, where one owner sells their interest back to the overall.
All right. So property assessed in more than one town. These are always going to be invalid because you're only assessing a portion of the overall value for the property. This would be true regardless of whether or not the piece in the other town also sold at the same time. Because in that case, if it were all in your town, it would be considered a subdivision. So maybe at the time of reappraisal, you could consider these, but for the most part, property assessed in more than one town will always be invalid. So a wording example would say sale includes 50 acres in, quote, the name of the abutting town. If you can add the last 5 of the span number, because you're using the GIS maps, bonus points. But this small or short example is sufficient.
Yeah.
Anything to add here, Christy?
Nope, I think that's perfect.
And would you like to talk about excessive personal property?
Sure. So sometimes properties will sell with what we consider to be excessive personal property. So again, you have to think about what type of property is, what's typical in the market. So if we talk about your normal dwelling, it's typical that the refrigerator and the stove will go with the sale, maybe even the washer or dryer, right? So we don't consider those excessive personal property. But if that same house was listed on MLS and it said includes all contents, furniture, and all contents of the house, right? That's a different animal. So we want to be able to talk about those kind of things and consider whether or not we should remove it from the study. The ultimate statutory line here is that if a person is selling a property with personal property, they're supposed to claim it on the PTTR. So those are the easy ones, right? If we see it on the PTTR, Pat's system will adjust for it, take it out, and we will have an adjusted sales price. If they're not on the PTTR, those are the ones we're talking about here, where we have some indication somewhere else of that it was personal property. If it's a large amount of personal property, then we want to be able to reflect it, and we'll probably take it out if it's more than, say, 25%. We'll probably take the entire sale out because we can't put our hands on what exactly that dollar amount is. There are small occasions where if the buyer and the seller exactly agree that it was $10,000, we may adjust the sales price. If we have 2 sales verification forms, exactly the same number, but that happens very few and far between. So it's more likely that we're going to remove the sale if it's considered excessive, and we can't put a dollar figure on it, but we need you to prove that it was in fact excessive. An example of that might be, you see on MLS, the lake property, and right in the descriptive, it says includes all kayaks and large ski boat, etc. Right?
Mhm.
That might be an example.
Yep. Another place that you might find this information is at the end of the deed. I'm seeing more frequently that the real property deed that's recorded, the warranty or the claim includes a paragraph of this document will also serve as a bill of sale for these pieces. And they might be listing the tractor because they have a mile-long driveway and they want to plow their own, or the pieces that Christie's mentioned, the antique furniture valued at X dollars.
Yep.
So besides the sales verification letter, there are other resources that might be available. So that's where the diligence comes in.
Yep.
So subdivisions, unlike the partial interest where you're only giving up a piece of your interest in the property, you're not just giving away a whole chunk. We're talking about the sale of property conveying only a portion of the assessed unit will be excluded because the total listed value will not match the portion that's sold. So again, we're talking about for this year, in your 2024 grand list, if it was, let's say, a 50-acre parcel and they've chopped off and they're selling 10 acres, that is a subdivision. Caveat here, some towns with more robust zoning might have subdivision permits that were approved years before, and those pieces are just now selling. That is still going to be a subdivision because in your 2024 grand list, the ownership is still identical, so they're going to be taxed on one span number. Okay, that's the piece that I really want to hit home, particularly for the larger towns that have the more robust zoning and assessing offices that process and create those subdivisions before the sale has actually occurred. They will not be considered valid sales at the time unless you are a reappraisal town. So again, in your documentation, there is a bold section at the top of number 11 or page number 11 that says for reappraisal towns, these subdivision sales would be considered because we are using current grand list value and therefore the comparison may be accurate if no other changes were made to that parcel post sale. And we'll get more in depth in that when we do our reappraisal series.
Yep.
Okay. In the interest of time, I'm going to keep moving because we want to make sure that Pat has enough time for his demo. So the other catch-all category. This category should be used for atypical situations where none of the other categories are appropriate. We require a written explanation for these sales. And we're going to give you some examples that we have seen. Christy, you want to talk about how to relocate quickly?
Yep. So if for some reason the buyer or seller had to move or buy quickly, for example, they had to go to the nursing home, they couldn't take care of the property, couldn't afford it, were transferred for work, those are all situations that might affect the sales price and therefore might be a 19 because there really isn't another scenario for it. So example might be town sales verification from seller's son states that she can no longer keep the property up and sold at a loss in order to move into a nursing home. Good example, right? Another one is seller was in her 90s and could no longer live alone or afford the taxes. She's on the delinquent tax report for the last 2 years.
And I can tell that I wrote those particular examples because they are very long. You could probably pare that down just a little bit. But all right, so then we also have close friends. So on that sales verification form we showed earlier, we had family or close friends. There's no caveat on the PTTR for close friends, but I would say 9 times out of 10 in a small town, you know the relationships between a lot of the folks in town, and you might question whether or not that acquaintance or close friendship impacted that sale. Another reason to use the sales verification form.
And important for me there is that a lot of times when you send those sale verification forms, one says that they're friends and one says that they're not. So did it really impact the sale? Just because I say you're my friend doesn't mean I'm going to give you a deal, right?
That's a very fair distinction. I'm sorry I missed that part. We do see that very often and
yes.
If the other party only knew that they were not friends. So boundary adjustments, that's a transfer of property. So that's going to require a PTTR. It might be, less than 1/10 of an acre. It could be a couple acres, but those are also, typically a butter sales too. So you would put those here, sales that involve a deferral of a permit. Property swaps are a 1031 exchange.
Yeah.
And, there are any other number of examples. We're not going to talk about them in this class, but if you have something that doesn't fit any of this criteria, then go ahead and call your DA and have a chat. I would also add, because we talked about it earlier, that the mobile home sales to a park owner, this is where you're going to put them.
Yep.
Oh, I do. Okay, here we go. A butter sales. Do you want to talk about a butters, Christine?
Sure. So this is when the buyer, right, is buying something that either directly abuts or is very close to a property they already own. So the reason that we want to get that out, well, you might think it's fair market value, is because they typically will either buy it for less because they know the person or more because they want to protect their property. We have to have a one size fits all, so we exclude all the butter sales.
Mhm.
So if you can give us that information, and an example would be a butter sale, the buyer already owns span, and give us the last 5 digits, we can quickly click on the map and confirm that they do in fact own that abutting property. Okay, it might also be a situation where that abutting property is owned by a business where that buyer is a principal of. So in that situation, you really need to give us the details so that we can research it a little further. ABC Corporation is owned by John Smith, and John Smith also owns this parcel. Okay, that kind of example.
All right, and we'll hurry up through number 21, which is large change post assessment. And then we'll get to any questions before we hand things off to Pat. So large change post assessment. This is for when someone has made improvements or has taken down a building or a building had burned, etc. Between April 1st of the preceding year and the date of sale. So we're not talking about if the last time you visited this property was in 2004 and then the property sells and you're now aware of it. That's not what we're talking about here. Every year on April 1st, that is the date of assessment annually. So we're going to be looking for two things here. We're going to be looking for what is the lister practice? Is it pretty typical that your values change in the year after the year after a sale, because now you're aware of something that you weren't previously? Maybe it was interior and you couldn't see it from doing your annual drive through town, or what have you. Christy, you want to expand on that?
Yeah, I think somebody touched on this earlier. So an example might be that you assessed it April 1 of 2024, right? And the barn burned down and then they sold it. Okay. So if you always think about what would be the picture of what that property would be when I assessed it, barn was there, then it sold in August and there was no barn. Okay. I don't have apples to apples, and likely I'm not reflecting the same amount. So I want to be fair and I want to say, okay, we're going to kick that out because it's not fair. The second piece that we're going to look at is, that's fine. Did you in April 1 of 2025 take the barn off? So are your listing practices consistent to show that you're keeping up with these major changes? Okay. If you didn't adjust it in the subsequent year, we might say, oh, you know what? We're not going to take it out because this is the listing practices there. They're not keeping up with these things. Okay. And that's why if you look at the examples here, we're asking for what the new listed value is after you address it, not because we're going to use it, but because we want to prove that you did in fact address that issue that was a change.
So in the thing that I just scrolled past, but you mentioned it, we'll hit it home. If that listed value does not change in the subsequent year, the sale will not be removed for a large change post assessment. It might be removed for one of the other criteria, but we will not consider it for a change.
And you have to be super careful here because we're talking about large change. We're not talking about a 10 by 10 shed that probably didn't really affect that sales price very much, right? We're not talking about they put in some new carpet in one room. All right, we're talking about a major change that would significantly impact the sale price.
One situation I had in a town was there was a road that now has a beautiful view over the Connecticut River Valley, and you can see Mount Washington. At the time of reappraisal in '04, it was fully forested. And then all of a sudden, the sales started to come in that the land and the property was selling for exponentially more. And the description was that they were selling with a view. So once the listers went and looked, they realized, oh yeah, everybody on this road now has a great view. That's a great adjustment. So that might be something that would be considered post or large change post assessment, even though it's not directly on the property. So something to consider.
Okay. So we'll do a quick PowerPoint presentation here, then I'll do a little demo. So 2025 update, we do have a lot of new modules that are live, grand lift exemptions and TIF, and we're actively resolving some bugs on those. So I know we've got some tickets and things to clean up. We're all actively working on that. Then the last thing we have to deploy is billing. So stay tuned. That's the last thing on our agenda. So today we're going to talk about sales validation. I'm just going to skip through some of the stuff that you guys have already heard about this morning. So we'll talk about non-reappraisal and reappraisal towns. So if you're in the the reappraisal towns, we're going to use those prior 2 years of sales and move them all up to listed value. So that's not something you have to do manually. If you're in a reappraisal, once you finish it, just make sure that your DA knows that you're done. So that we can take those CAMA values and process them through to all of your prior 2 year sales. So all those current year listed values are automatically put in. Then we'll take some questions. So when you're validating sales, you're verifying a bunch of information. So the sale price and the listed value, that is your ratio. If you're having a hard time remembering which way the ratio goes, it's alphabetical. Assessed over sale always. Special circumstances, you guys just talked about that a bunch. You're verifying the category code. If there was personal property or concessions included, the acreage, and then adding your comments. So just how the PTTR import process works. And this is particularly important, as we heard just a little bit ago, that your clerk submits these in a timely manner, particularly around April 1st, because that's how we get the sales. If the PTTR is not there, the sale is not there. So make sure that your town's all caught up for the year. That gets sent to the state. They then send it to VTPI. We link those PTTR, those sale records, to the SPAN. We update the prior year listed value, the acreage, and the category code from what we got from your August submission of the previous year. If you're under reassessment, it would be the current year. So then we turn that over to you for local verification. And then finally, state verification is the last step. By default, you and the state agree. So if you say don't use a sale and you give special circumstances, by default, the state agrees. So the only reason it would be different is if they've uncovered some new information, and we'll talk about that as well. So of course, you just want to have arm's length transactions. We just talked about this, so I'm going to skip this slide and just move past it. So we'll look at things in the PowerPoint, and then I'll show you right in the app. So the first thing here, if you look in the upper left of that screenshot, we've got the town, we're in the equalization study section, and then in sales. And by default, it selects you on your unverified sales. So this is your work queue. You can also switch that to show verified sales, and that will show any sales that you've already verified but have not submitted to the state yet. You have a listing here of questions, so questions that the state has asked you. In this case, we see 0. And down here on the right, we see the span that is associated currently with this sale. So you can change this, and if you look at the second to the bottom, there's one missing. So we couldn't find the correct property. Most often it's a typo on the span on the PTTR. It's less than 1% of the sales statewide that have that. So if you do see that, we'll talk about how you do put the correct property on that. Or if the wrong property is linked, we'll show you how to correct that as well. So your reports drop down is here. So this is where you can always, always, always get a listing of all of the sales that are in your ratio study. So even if you've submitted everything to the state and you don't see the sales in this interface, this report will give you always all of the sales. And this is the same place you find that pre-excluded sale report. So that is a good thing to take a peek at. We don't do the pre-excluding. It's actually as it comes into the tax system. But this shows you everything that's being automatically pulled out. And as the DA's indicated, sometimes things get pulled out that could be used. So particularly if you have very few sales, you definitely want to take a look at this report and make sure that there's nothing that we could use. So then looking at a particular sale, we're just going to go through and dissect the sales overview screen here. There's a lot going on, so we're just going to take it step by step. The first thing is our help up in the top of the screen here. So clicking on that blue eye will bring you to help about this specific page. Then we have PTTR information. So this is the buyer and the seller mailing address. And then that bottom property address is as reported on the PTTR. So if you have no grand list parcel associated with the sale yet, these are the pieces of information that you use to figure out which property that should go to. Down here, we have our grand list information. So this is a direct link to the grand list data that you've uploaded. So if this is blank, again, you haven't linked it to a property yet, and that's less than 1% of the sales, so it won't happen very often, but this is directly what it says in the grand list that you sent up to the state. And finally, our verification. So we start with whatever comes in on the PTTR, and that just stays. So this will always be the same. There's no editing of that. It's just what came in the door. The next piece here, we have what we're calling a lister edit. So this is where you as the lister can go in and correct anything that needs to be corrected. So maybe the sale price had a typo in it, what have you. You can make whatever adjustments you need there, personal property, concessions, all that sort of stuff. The missing column to the right is the state column, right? That's where they do their work. So they see what came in on the PTTR, what the lister says, and then by default, the state agrees. Unless they have more information, need to override something. So to verify a sale, we have our verify button right up here. If we click on that, here's the first piece of the information that we're verifying. So this is our sale price, our current and listed value at time of sale. Remember the distinction there, current grand list value is used in reappraisal towns and listed value at time of sale is used everywhere else. Our sale price personal property. Down below, we have our special circumstances and category codes. And just to highlight again, the current grand list value, the listed value at time of sale, both will be populated from your grand list automatically. The total sale price, so this is including your personal property and concessions. Those are subtracted, and then that creates the top real property sale price. So once you've verified the sale, we have our submit button here. So this is to send it off to the state. So this will take it out of your control and give it to the state control so they can start their work. Which again, you want to get this done as quickly as you can so the state can move through their process. But if you're waiting for something, if you have a sales verification letter out that's going to inform your decision on whether or not to include it, just wait until you get that back to submit it to the state. But if you do have all the information and you're confident as to whether or not it should be included or not, go ahead and submit that to the state so that they can start working on that on their end as well. So going back out to the listing of sales, if I switch my drop down to show only verified, I'll see the records that I verified and not released to the state. And clicking this release button sends everything I've verified all in one shot off to the state. So you could go through and verify all of your sales. They'll sit here in the verified section until you click release, at which point they will all be sent to the state in one group. So what happens if you can't link the PTTR, or if we couldn't, I'm sorry, you will be able to. If we couldn't link the PTTR to the grand list, again, most often just a typo in the span. It's not going to let you verify it. Instead of the verify button, it's going to say, please attach a property on the properties tab. Clicking on that link or clicking on the properties tab does the same thing. It's going to bring you to where you can pick out the correct property. So we're going to add a property. You're going to search for the correct record, click search, and then pick one or more records if it's a multi-parcel sale that need to be associated and click add. So that's it. That's how you fix that. Just search for the correct property, and I'll show you in the app if the wrong property is linked. You can switch that as well if it needs to be a different span. So now we are in the application here. And just a reminder, if folks work in multiple jurisdictions, you can request that we add multiple jurisdictions to your user account. So you don't need separate logins if you are someone that works across multiple jurisdictions. So here's what we're going to focus on, our equalization study. And we see that we've done some work, but we've got a few more left to verify. And the state has also done some work, but they have a few more left to verify. So we're going to go in here, we're going to click on sales verification, and here's my listing of unverified sales. So we talked about switching this over to verified. This will show us all the verified sales that we haven't released yet. Switch it over to unverified. One important thing, and particularly if you're getting a sales verification letter back or you're on the phone with somebody and you got some information about a particular sale, you can use any of these searches to find that sale that you're looking for to add information to it. So any of these will work. You can search by sale price, date, the document number, buyer, seller, span, etc. That will let you get down to a sale very quickly. Again, we've got the pre-excluded and the sales summary report available for you, and I just want to show you the sales summary quickly. So this is Excel, and it gives you every sale that will be used and the three versions of the truth, so to speak, what the PTTR says, what the local lister said upon verification, and what the state is saying after their review. So again, by default, everybody agrees, but you can always run this study and see if there are anything different, see what the state chose to use, if it was your value or something different. So this is always available to you. And obviously, the sooner you guys get in and verify your sales, the sooner the state can do it. And then the longer time you'll have to kind of take a peek at what they've done and ask questions and so forth before we get into the late fall and finalizing studies. So we'll go ahead and click on a sale here. Again, I could pick any sale, just pick the top one because I'm not very creative. So again, this is the screen that we were looking at. We've got our properties tab over here. Adding a property, that was the screen that I showed you where you just search for the property by local parcel ID, span, owner, address, etc. If you need to remove a property, just remove it. If it's more than one, it's going to add everything up for you. So you can just add more properties if it's multi, and it will just add everything up and do that for you. Here we have our attachments. This is super handy. Anything about the sale that speaks to whether or not it should be included, very good to attach it here. These persist year over year, so there won't be any guessing if you invalidate something this year and put, the building permit for that new barn, say that you didn't assess as of April 1st, it was put up in the summer. That will persist forward so that when the sale is re-reviewed, say if you're doing a reappraisal, all that documentation will still be with it. Finally, questions. Once you submit all your sales to the state, they might come back with questions, just a message board format. You can answer the question, And that too will stay with the sale in the subsequent 2 years when it's included. If you are doing a reappraisal, you should see this little flag up here, reappraisal in red. That is your cue and the DA's cue that this is a reappraisal town and they should be using the current year grand list value. So we do have this toggle over here that you can request that the state send a sales verification letter. If you click that, it'll go into the queue. I believe they go out every Tuesday. So clicking that will just generate a letter on the state side and send that off. Again, here's our PTTR information, our grand list information. Clicking this hyperlink will bring you right to the map for that property. If you need credentials, you can submit a support ticket for that. We'll have that at the very end. Our verification information. So again, the PTTR, the lister, and then this column would be the state. So we can go in and verify. And again, all of these are overridable. We talked a lot about special circumstances. So if we pick one of the special circumstances code, if there is guidance, it's going to give it to you over here. Please provide the relationship of the grantor and the grantee. If it's an abutter sale, please provide the last digits of the span of the abutting property. And it's going to look for something to be in the comments down here if you see that up here. So a little bit of guidance with these. My family relationship, not so good. I can save it, which won't verify it, or I can verify it, which will save it and verify it and basically say I'm done. So you can put in notes here, but not verify it if you want it to stay in your work queue. Or you can verify it and the submit button will show up here. So if I click submit, it'll be available to the state for editing and it will no longer be available to me as the lister for editing. If you do this by accident or something new comes to light, just reach out to your DA. They have the reverse button of this where they can just send one sale back to you, or the entire town, they can send everything back to you. So don't worry about submitting to the state. If you think you're done, but it turns out you're not, totally okay. Just let your DA know that you need to get back in there. Do have this little advance button here so you can go to the next sale. And just kind of work through them that way. So it should go fairly quickly. And I'm just going to switch back over to my PowerPoint here for a couple last points. I know we're a couple minutes over. Apologies for that. Recommendations for success. You're going to want to have a 2025 working CAMA uploaded. And right, particularly helpful for subdivisions, right? If you've got different properties that are selling and so forth, you want to make sure that those are there if they exist yet. Also begin your sales validation early. Those sales will be available to you guys very shortly. And I'm sure Christy will let you know when they are available and she'll let me know when I should make them available. So get that done as early as you can so that you can get that off to the state so they can begin their work. And again, the longer you give the state that they can look at this, you can then go in and also take a look and you can discuss any sales that you might have concerns about. And, try to get all that sorted out as early as possible so it's not a fire drill at the end of the year.
Pat, it's Deanna. Could I have you hop back over to
Yep.
VT Pi and show them how to make sure that they've released all of their sales?
Sure.
And it is in our document. Most of the things that you've heard from Pat so far are available in snips and some instructions that we provided at the end of the document, but we figured you didn't want to hear it twice, so we let Pat do his demonstration for us.
Yep. So what we'd want to do to make sure that they're all released, number one, we can see that right here. 80 of 105 are released to the state. So not all of them. But we've verified 94 and released 80. So there are 14 here that we've done, but we haven't sent to the state. So this is your indication of where you're at overall. And to be sure that you send all of this to the state, just flip over to verified and click release. And I'll go ahead and do it. And they're gone. So when you're done, you want verified to have nothing in it, and you want unverified, your work queue, to have nothing in it. So you want everything out the door. It's all off to the state. You're done. You can always run this report to see, which sales are being included, which sales are not being included, and if the state is choosing something different than what you put down. Always available here for you. Did that address what you wanted, Deanna?
It absolutely did. And then you just had that reports drop down available. Earlier in the class, we did talk about reviewing the pre-excluded sales report to see if there was anything that didn't get included that you believe should have been.
Yep, and I'll pop that up right now. So
Should be
these are the
search-
pre-excludeds.
Yep, this is where you're going to expect to see those family sales, those $0 sales, or those really low, like you'll see one at the bottom that says $250 with a listed value of $54,000. Those don't make sense. Maybe it's totally valid and you want us to add it back in. Those are the things to take a look at.
Okay, so last little bit here. As Deanna indicated, there is a step-by-step guide. There's also the help materials in the application. This training session will be, it is being recorded, and it'll be available to you as well. Two methods for help. You can either contact Catalyst, formerly known as Axiomatic, or your advisor. Our contact info is on the right-hand side now. Note there's a new support email. Goes to the same people, but the email is new. How to determine, should you contact your DA or should you talk to Catalyst? If you don't know what you should be doing, in other words, that barn burnt down and you're not quite sure if you should be using the sale or not, we can't help you with that, but your DA can. If you do know exactly what you want to do and you can't seem to make VTPI do it, or you're getting an error, or you're just having trouble, that would be Catalyst. So if you know what you do, if you know what you want to do, but you don't know how to do it in the software, that's Catalyst. If you don't know what you should be doing and you really need advice, that is PVR. So that's what I had prepared, and apologies for going just a couple minutes over here.
That's entirely our fault, Pat. Before we let you go, can I have you go to VTPI and click the help button on the left side banner?
Sure.
I noticed something that looked a little different the other day, and I'm not sure how many others have also seen the same thing. So I just wanted, while we had a captive audience. Oh, your help looks a little bit different than mine. If you see something that looks different than what just popped up on your screen, what I'm seeing on my end, let's see if I can pull it up real quick.
On it. So we are migrating from this platform, so there will be a switch over, but the information will be the same.
So here, I'll go ahead and share my screen just in case the folks on the call are seeing what I'm seeing. Because it took me a minute. So when you click the help, like Pat did, this is what I'm seeing on my side now. So it opens up the support ticket right off the bat, instead of bringing you to those instructions that were there previously. Those are going to be found under this knowledge tab, which I didn't realize that those were tabs at first, but I didn't know if you wanted to talk about that at all here.
Yep, sure. I think you got it. It is, all the stuff is in the knowledge tab here, and we're actually in process of migrating everything over and doing all the hyperlinks. So the individual links will go to the individual pages on the original help, but we're moving everything over bit by bit.
Okay. And Vermont is over here because we're towards the end of the alphabet. In tax and CAMA, we're all the way over here on the right. And then when you click there, we're going to get back to those documents. So if you're looking for them and it looks different, they're still there, but that's how you'll find them.
Quick question. Do sale validation letters sent by PVR get scanned and attached in VTPI?
So the answer to that question is yes. When the district advisor reviews them, we also attach them. There is not currently a functionality, and correct me if I'm wrong, Pat, for you to see them in real time. But in a reappraisal year, when you get 3 years worth of sales back, you will see those sales verification letters. And I know some of us try and hold on to the physical copies of those so that when we come and visit you, if you want us to bring them, we can actually bring you the hard copies because we keep them in a PDF format.